In the winter of 1946-1947, London was not supposed to fall. The war was over. Victory banners still hung in pubs. Children played on bombed-out streets, waiting for life to feel normal again. But then came the cold. The kind of cold that didn't just freeze water, it froze hope. Coal reserves vanished. Electricity blinked out. Food queues stretched for blocks. Frost bit through cracked windows as families burned furniture to stay alive. It was a winter that punished London harder than the Blitz. A winter that starved cities, shut down trains, silenced factories, and pushed a nation already exhausted from war to the edge of collapse. This is the story of the winter that tried to kill London. London entered the winter of 1946 with a familiar kind of exhaustion. The Second World War had officially ended more than a year earlier. Adolf Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany had collapsed. The Luftwaffe no longer prowled the skies. Britain had survived the Blitz, rationing, nightly blackouts, and 6 years of total war. By every measure, London should have been recovering. Yet the city was not celebrating. It was waiting. And what London awaited was not prosperity or renewal, but a difficult and uncertain peace. When victory was declared in May 1945, British citizens filled the streets with a level of joy that only survival could produce. But the cheering did not erase the damage. More than 30,000 civilians in London had been killed during the war. Tens of thousands more were injured or displaced. Entire neighborhoods lay in rubble from bombing raids that had turned homes, shops, roads, and railways into twisted debris. The Thames flowed past a capital that was physically scarred and economically broken. Housing shortages shaped daily life. Roughly 250,000 London homes had been destroyed or seriously damaged by German bombs. Many families lived with relatives. Others occupied temporary shelters or government-issued prefabricated houses. Walls were thin. Insulation was poor. Winter winds slipped inside the buildings as if the war had never ended. The sight of ruined streets had once represented the price of victory. Now, they were a reminder that peace brought no instant relief. Across Britain, rationing remained stricter in 1946 than it had been during parts of the war. Meat, fats, sugar, bread, and even clothing were controlled by the government. Queues outside grocery shops and market stalls continued daily, sometimes longer than before. The British state faced a severe financial crisis. It had borrowed enormous sums from the United States during the war. Export industries were damaged. Trade routes were unstable, and the nation was struggling to feed and heat itself in the new peace. Although Londoners were used to doing without, they expected the worst years to be behind them. They believed the bombs, the blackouts, and the constant fear had been the ultimate test. They had endured evacuation, air raid sirens, and gas mask drills. They had saved scrap metal, grown vegetables in small city gardens, and lived by coupons and rationed books. For 6 years, the British public had been told that sacrifice would lead to a better future once the war was won. That message had held the nation together. In 1946, people waited for the proof. The British government also believed recovery was coming soon. The Labour Party, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee, had won a landslide election in July 1945, promising to rebuild the nation through large-scale social reforms. The National Health Service had not yet been founded, but plans were underway. The government nationalized major industries and worked to create job programs. But these efforts required energy and resources to things Britain was dangerously short of. The British coal industry was at the center of the problem. Coal powered the nation. It heated homes, fueled trains, and supplied electricity to factories. Yet production was low. Many mines were flooded, damaged, or short-staffed. Equipment was old. Thousands of miners had been in military service and had not returned to the pits. Britain imported coal from other countries during the war, but foreign shipments were now limited and too expensive. Most of Europe had also been devastated by wartime destruction. The continent's agricultural output was shattered. Farmland across France, Belgium, Poland, and the Netherlands needed years to recover. Britain depended on imports for a large portion of its food. In 1946, those imports arrived slowly and in small quantities. Every shortage increased the strain on ordinary families. Even soap, paper, and potatoes ran low at times. The war was over, but scarcity had become a permanent condition. The psychological toll of war shaped life as deeply as the economic one. Thousands of veterans returned to London carrying physical injuries or emotional trauma. The government called it shell shock during the First World War, but by 1946, the term had expanded to war neurosis, a condition affecting many who had fought in the air, on land, or at sea. Hospitals were overcrowded. Doctors faced growing numbers of patients needing long-term care. People expected gratitude and opportunity when the conflict ended. Instead, many felt forgotten. Meanwhile, those who had remained in London throughout the bombings were still rebuilding their lives. The daily routine of air raids had disappeared, but the sensation of danger remained. It was visible in cracked walls, in boarded windows, in entire districts where chimneys stood over collapsed rooms. Streets that once held homes and schools were empty lots waiting for reconstruction, but rebuilding was slow and expensive. The city's skyline was a mixture of renewal and ruin. For many Londoners, the clearest reminder of hardship was fuel. A rationing system had been implemented to manage heating coal. Households were allotted only small amounts, and many could not afford even that. Winters during the late 1940s were already colder than average. The cold found every weakness in damaged houses. Windows repaired with layered newspapers, roofs patched with scrap metal, chimneys that no longer drew smoke properly. Families survived under piles of blankets or pushed beds into kitchens where the stove offered a little heat. Still, even in the middle of these challenges, optimism survived. Children filled schoolyards where buildings had been repaired. Small cinemas reopened despite shortages of electricity. New buses rolled through the streets with advertisements promising a brighter future. And across the country, people married, started families, and searched for work with the expectation that life would slowly improve. The winter of 1946 arrived gradually. October and early November were cool but not alarming. Weather forecasts mentioned colder days ahead, but Britain had endured harsh winters before. Many newspapers compared the period to 1929 or 1933. Farmers noticed early frost, but harvests had already been collected. Coal deliveries slowed, but that was not unusual for late autumn. In London, shops decorated windows for Christmas as they had done even during wartime, when glass shortages forced many to use wooden boards and painted signs. What London did not know was that it stood on the edge of one of the most severe winters of the 20th century. Meteorologists were aware of unusual weather patterns forming over Scandinavia and Russia. Arctic air was pushing south, creating what modern scientists would call a prolonged cold snap. At the time, Forecasting tools were limited. Daily reports warned citizens to expect snow, but not the scale or duration of what was coming. In December, temperatures dropped quickly. Snow settled across rooftops and railway lines. Londoners wrapped themselves in heavy coats, remembering the war years when fuel shortages had briefly forced similar conditions. Families placed bricks near fires and used them as foot warmers in bed. Children scraped frost from inside their bedroom windows. It was uncomfortable, but manageable. The city believed it had endured worse. Yet the government sensed danger. Electricity demand surged as temperatures fell. Coal deliveries slowed again, this time because transport lines were freezing. Mines struggled as machinery malfunctioned in the cold. By Christmas, coal shipments to London were significantly below the levels needed to power the grid. Factories and power stations began to restrict electricity usage. Some industrial sites shut early to conserve fuel. In previous winters, the public accepted these inconveniences, but the war had exhausted the population's patience. 6 years of sacrifice had been followed by 18 months of deprivation. Letters to newspapers accused government officials of mismanagement. Members of Parliament warned of a potential national crisis. The Ministry of Fuel and Power issued cautious statements assuring the public that reserves remained adequate. In reality, Britain's stockpile was dangerously low, despite the worsening conditions. London entered January with the belief that it had overcome hardship before and would overcome it again. The capital had survived the Great Fire of 1666, the Blitz of 1940, and centuries of political turmoil. A harsh winter seemed like one more temporary challenge, but there were warning signs. Rivers froze at the edges. Road traffic slowed under layers of ice. Railway lines cracked. The cold seeped into hospitals, government buildings, and schools. London's most vulnerable residents, the elderly, the poor, and those living in damaged houses suffered first. What no one knew was that this winter would last far longer than expected. Snowstorms would return again and again. Temperatures would plunge below freezing for weeks at a time. Coal supplies would reach historic lows. Electricity would disappear from homes, streets, and factories. London, already weakened by war and rationing, would face a new test of endurance this time, not from bombs, but from cold. The city believed it had survived everything. The winter of 1946 would prove that survival had only just begun. Snow entered. London quietly in the final days of January 1947. It was not the first snowfall of the winter, but it was the first that truly settled. Flakes drifted through the air, light at first, then steady, covering pavements and rooftops with a thin, clean layer that softened the harsh lines of a city still scarred by war. After years of rubble, craters, and broken brick, fresh snow gave London a moment of unexpected calm. Newspapers treated the weather as a welcome distraction. The Daily Express reported scenes of seasonal cheer, capturing photographs of children throwing snowballs on bomb sites that only a short time earlier had been the center of air raids. The Daily Mirror published a light-hearted column describing London as a Christmas postcard arriving late. For once, the headlines did not speak of shortages or reconstruction, but of sledging, snowmen, and temporary escape. Even rationing took on a different tone in the snow. Milk deliveries were delayed, bread queues moved more slowly, and coal merchants warned of transport disruptions, but many Londoners brushed off the inconvenience. The war had required them to adapt to far worse. Workers pushed stalled vehicles through icy streets. Tram conductors salted platforms to prevent passengers from slipping. Schoolchildren dragged sledges along roads lined with damaged houses, laughing at the novelty of winter's arrival. The temperature dropped further during the first week of February. Frost hardened on windows, white patches spread across the Thames bridges, and chimneys released thick plumes of coal smoke as households fought to keep warm. But the cold was still manageable. Families layered blankets against drafty windows and warmed hands around teapots. The novelty of snow remained intact. Meteorologists took note of the worsening conditions, though forecasting in 1947 offered only limited early warning. Britain lacked satellite data and modern storm tracking tools. Weather stations across the country simply reported falling temperatures, increasing frost, and a slow, persistent arrival of Arctic air from the north. Radio broadcasts mentioned hazardous roads and rail delays, but there was no indication of national danger. London's transport network absorbed the early impact. Buses slipped on icy streets. Drivers carried sand to spread when tyres lost traction. Southern Railway and the London and North Eastern Railway announced minor timetable changes as points froze and locomotives struggled to gain grip. Commuters grumbled but continued travelling. People remembered wartime mornings when incendiary bombs blocked tracks and shrapnel littered platforms. Snow seemed mild by comparison, but temperatures continued to fall. By the second week of February, Britain was trapped under one of the longest cold spells of the 20th century. Day after day, the country sat below freezing. The air remained dry and still, with a silence unfamiliar to a city that had spent 6 years listening for bombers. London's rivers and canals began developing sheets of ice. Parks froze. Trees stood motionless under a buildup of frost that thickened instead of melting at first. The public treated these changes as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Snowfall reached record heights in parts of southeast England. Drifts built up against homes and blocked alleyways. Children, released from school because classrooms were too cold to heat properly, spent hours playing outside. In some neighborhoods, bomb craters filled with snow and became makeshift sledding hills. Newspapers again printed photographs of games and winter fun, though headlines began referencing numbing temperatures and Arctic blasts. Then came the first sign that the weather was more serious than expected. Coal shortages, already strained, became critical. Deliveries from the mines slowed as machinery froze and workers struggled to reach pitheads through snow. Railways that carried coal from mining regions in Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands reported constant delays. Wagons became immobilized under thick layers of ice. Locomotives fought against frozen points and iced over rails. Even when trains reached London, unloading coal required heavy labor under harsh conditions. Government officials realized the problem was growing faster than the public understood. On February 5th, the Ministry of Fuel and Power, led by Emmanuel Shinwell, issued the first of a series of emergency limitations. Electricity supplies to industries were reduced. Factories that depended on constant power began shutting down. Newspapers switched to smaller print formats to save paper and energy. Broadcasting hours were cut. The BBC faced restrictions that removed popular programs from the air, a measure unseen even during wartime. Despite these warnings, many citizens still viewed snow as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Snowplows cleared major roads. The London County Council dispatched workers to break ice on sidewalks. But the cold continued at a historic scale. For 10 straight days, temperatures did not climb above freezing anywhere in the country. In some areas, they dropped as low as -12 degrees Celsius. Freezing fog settled across the capital. Thick and unmoving, it reduced visibility and carried soot from coal smoke through the air, creating a sharp chemical smell that lingered in alleys and around factories. Pedestrians moved cautiously along icy roads, while shopkeepers scraped frost from windows. Hospitals treated rising numbers of injuries from falls and frostbite, but staffing and heat shortages limited capacity. The winter also exposed weaknesses in the housing system. Thousands of homes damaged during the Blitz allowed winter air to pour through gaps in broken walls and patched roofs. Window panes repaired with makeshift materials during the war were now brittle and cracked. Families covered them with fabric or paper in a desperate attempt to block the cold. Steel-framed windows, common in post-war construction, condensed instantly, leaving rooms damp and freezing. Londoners responded with resilience, as they had during the war. Parents wrapped children in extra layers made from recycled wool. Neighbors shared coal when possible. Some families pushed beds into the kitchen, sleeping near the stove for warmth. Others heated bricks or flattians and placed them under blankets before climbing into bed. It was survival through improvisation, a method Britain had not expected to need again so soon after victory. As February progressed, humour began to fade. Streets narrowed as snow piled on sidewalks. Bus routes shut down. Milk vans struggled to complete deliveries. The Thames saw ice forming along banks and between piers, a rare event for the river's tidal waters. Winter scenery that had looked picturesque only weeks earlier now signalled danger. Coal consumption raced ahead of supply. Britain's reserves stood at dangerously low levels, and what remained was difficult to move. Miners worked in brutal conditions to maintain output, but the cold froze equipment and cut off transportation routes. Collieries in Yorkshire and Wales reported tunnels filled with ice. Surplus coal could not be shipped by sea because ports were frozen or blocked by snow-covered roads. On February 10th, the government escalated restrictions. Electricity to homes was cut for hours at a time. Street lighting was reduced. Shops were ordered to close early. Homes without fireplaces had almost no heat. The blackout of wartime returned not from fear of bombers, but from lack of fuel. Newspapers could no longer portray the winter as harmless. Headlines spoke of fuel crisis, coal emergency, and national paralysis. Letters from citizens demanded accountability. Some accused the government of miscalculating reserves. Others claimed that coal miners were failing to meet production targets. Cabinet debates turned tense. Britain was running out of energy at the coldest moment of the century. The snow continued to fall. By mid-February, parts of England were buried under drifts more than 6 feet high. Rural villages became isolated, forcing the Royal Air Force to drop supplies by plane. In cities, frozen pipes burst, flooding basements that immediately turned to ice. Trains broke down on open lines, leaving passengers to walk through fields of snow to reach help. Life slowed to a near standstill. London began to realize the scale of the disaster. Factories and businesses were closing every day. As many as 4 million workers across the United Kingdom were temporarily unemployed, because there was no power to run machinery. Food shortages worsened as transportation failed. The public, already weary from years of rationing, now faced a winter that cut deeper than expected, and still the cold did not break. For more than a month, Britain endured sub-zero temperatures longer than anything in living memory. Scientific records showed that the winter of 1947 was not simply another cold season, but one of the most severe in the entire century. The snow London had once greeted with humour was now a threat to national survival. The first snow had seemed harmless. The city had laughed. It had taken photographs, built snowmen, and joked about late-arriving holiday weather. But each day, the temperature slipped lower. Each night, another inch of ice hardened across roads, railways, and canals. By February's end, it was clear. The winter was not a passing inconvenience. It was a crisis, and London, weakened by war and rationing, was about to face its hardest test since the Blitz. Coal was the energy system of post-war Britain. It heated homes, powered electricity stations, fueled factories, and kept trains moving. In 1947, nearly every aspect of British life depended on it. No other fuel came close to its importance. Oil was expensive and scarce. Gas supplies were limited. Electricity itself was generated almost entirely from burning coal. When coal stopped moving, Britain stopped moving. For decades, the nation had built its economy around this single resource. The coal fields of Yorkshire, South Wales, Scotland, and the Midlands formed the industrial backbone of the country. During the Second World War, miners worked under dangerous conditions to keep the war machine operating. Coal-powered steelworks that produced tanks and aircraft. It ran the railways that supplied troops and transported weapons. It fed the power stations that kept the lights on in war factories. But when peace arrived in 1945, the coal industry was worn down and in disrepair. Mines suffered from years of underinvestment. Machinery was outdated. Many shafts had been damaged during the war from lack of maintenance. Thousands of experienced miners had left to fight in the armed forces, and not all returned. Productivity never fully recovered. To rebuild the economy, the Labour government began a major nationalisation programme. On January 1st, 1947, the coal industry officially came under public ownership, becoming the National Coal Board. It was a historic reform, meant to modernise mining, improve working conditions, and guarantee energy security. But nationalisation arrived just weeks before the worst winter in living memory. The new organisation had inherited an industry already struggling, and the cold exposed its weaknesses quickly by early February. Snow and ice created problems the coal board could not solve. Mines were frozen. Machinery failed. Workers could not reach pitheads through blocked roads. Conveyor belts jammed. Water pumps inside mines iced over. In some collieries, conditions were so dangerous that production stopped entirely. Even when miners managed to extract coal, getting it to power stations became nearly impossible. Britain's railways, another system dependent on coal, faced their own collapse. Snowdrifts buried tracks across Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands. Station masters reported engines stuck fast under feet of solid ice. Frozen points prevented trains from switching lines. Coal wagons piled up in sidings, useless, because locomotives could not move them. In some regions, trains inched forward behind ploughing engines, clearing tracks only to see them blocked again overnight by drifting snow carried on freezing winds in past winters. Britain relied on sea routes to transport fuel when railways failed, but ports from Newcastle to Cardiff were choked with ice. Tugs could not manoeuvre. Colliers carrying coal could not dock. Coal stocks that were supposed to be held at power stations never arrived. Power station managers sent increasingly dire messages to the Ministry of Fuel and Power. Reserves were shrinking at a pace that threatened the electricity grid. The government responded with a series of emergency measures. On February 7, 1947, Fuel Minister Emmanuel Shinwell announced electricity cuts to industries and public services. Factories were ordered to reduce hours or shut down entirely. This was not a wartime blackout, this was a peacetime shutdown caused not by enemy attack, but by weather and collapsing infrastructure. Within days, an estimated 3 to 4 million workers across the United Kingdom were temporarily unemployed because machines could not run without power. Public reaction turned from frustration to anxiety. Newspapers questioned how a victorious nation had allowed its energy system to fail so completely. Opinion pieces accused the government of poor planning. Some blamed Shinwell personally, arguing that his ministry had underestimated the severity of the weather and ignored warnings about coal shortages. Members of Parliament demanded emergency debates. The crisis was no longer only environmental, it was political. To understand why Britain was so unprepared. The roots of the problem lay deeper than winter weather. Coal demand had risen sharply since the end of the war. Peacetime reconstruction required energy. Homes needed heat. Electricity usage nearly doubled between 1939 and 1947. The government planned to restore industrial output to pre-war levels. But factories built during the war now needed fuel to produce for civilian markets. Britain was trying to rebuild itself while staggering under the weight of debt, supply shortages, and rationing. Exports made the situation worse. The British economy depended heavily on selling coal abroad to earn foreign currencies, especially US dollars, which the government desperately needed to service wartime loans. Coal shipments to France, Belgium, and Scandinavia continued even as domestic shortages grew. Politicians feared that cutting exports would destroy Britain's credibility and damage diplomatic relationships in the fragile post-war world. But keeping exports flowing meant less coal for power stations, railways, and households at home. In coalfield communities, miners faced intense pressure. They worked in extreme cold, underground tunnels dripping with freezing water, air thick with dust from forced ventilation. Accidents increased. Some collieries reported machinery seized by ice. Others rationed dynamite because transportation networks could not deliver supplies. Even when miners extracted coal, much of it remained piled at pitheads with no trains to haul it away. Londoners became increasingly aware of the crisis as electricity shutdowns expanded. On February 10th, the government took a drastic step. Households and shops were banned from using electricity for heating. Advertising lights were switched off. Cinemas shortened operating hours. Radio broadcasts were cut to a few hours per day. Newspapers reduced page sizes to conserve energy used in printing. On some days, the BBC was ordered off the air entirely. For many citizens, that silence was the most unsettling sign of crisis since wartime. Even hospitals were affected. Without adequate heating, medical wards grew dangerously cold. Fuel shortages forced administrators to concentrate patients into fewer rooms so they could focus limited heat. Surgeries were postponed. Doctors wrapped patients in additional blankets and used hot water bottles where possible. But supplies ran out quickly. Small businesses suffered severely. Bakeries and laundries that relied on electric machinery closed. Butchers and grocers lost perishable goods when refrigeration systems shut down. The economic recovery many had hoped for after 1945 stalled in the winter of 1947. The promise of peace looked fragile. Throughout February, the coal crisis deepened. Some goods trains finally broke through snowdrifts. delivering small amounts of coal to London and the industrial Midlands. But the backlog was enormous. It was estimated that more than 12,000 wagons sat immobilized across the country, filled with coal that could not be moved. Power stations rationed their remaining stockpile day by day. In parts of the country, electricity was available for only a few hours at a time. When heat disappeared from homes, the public grew angry. People slept in overcoats and hats. Families gathered around kitchen stoves, the only reliable heat source left. The British public had accepted wartime sacrifice to fight a foreign enemy. But sacrifice in peacetime felt different. Editorials accused the government of poor judgment, mismanagement, or failure to stockpile coal before winter. Some critics argued that the decision to prioritize exports had been reckless. Others blamed nationalization, claiming that government control had been imposed too quickly on an industry not yet ready. Shinwell faced the storm of criticism directly. In the House of Commons, he defended government actions and described the winter as a natural disaster without modern precedent. He insisted that British miners were working to their limits, and that weather had paralyzed rail transport across the entire country. His arguments did little to satisfy public anger. In February and March, Shinwell received threatening letters, and crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding answers. The coal minister became a symbol of the crisis, fairly or not. Meanwhile, Britain's power stations continued to operate on the edge of collapse. Some had only hours of fuel left at a time. London, in particular, relied on coal-fired power to run trams, underground lines, water pumping stations, and gasworks. When electricity failed, essential services faltered. The result was a series of cascading problems: frozen pipelines, darkened streets, stalled transport, and an economy unable to function. In rural regions, the situation became even more severe. Villages cut off by snow received no fuel deliveries at all. Families burned whatever they could to stay warm: old furniture, spare wood, even books. The image of a modern industrial nation reduced to burning household belongings became a shocking symbol of the winter's impact. Britain was not the only European country suffering from extreme weather. In 1947, France faced similar shortages. The Netherlands experienced disastrous flooding when frozen rivers thawed. But Britain's crisis stood out for its severity and scale. No other Western nation suffered such a dramatic collapse of fuel supply. By late February, a slight break in the weather provided a temporary opening. Thawing snow allowed limited railway movement. Coal began to reach power stations again. Industries reopened, though many could only operate part-time. The government vowed to build larger reserve stockpiles, so the nation would never face such a collapse again. But the thaw did not bring relief. Instead, it triggered the next phase of the disaster: flooding that ruined farmland and further limited food supplies. Britain had entered 1947 expecting post-war recovery. Instead, it found itself trapped by one of the coldest winters of the century, crippled by energy shortages, and unprepared for the level of dependency its modern society placed on coal. The lifeline had snapped, and a country that believed it had endured its worst hardships was discovering that survival in peacetime demanded as much resilience as survival in war. Blackouts returned to London in February 1947. But this time there were no German bombers in the sky, no air raid sirens, no searchlights, no barrage balloons. Instead, the lights went out because Britain no longer had the coal to keep its power stations running. For a generation that believed the darkness of wartime had been left behind forever, The shock was immediate and deeply unsettling. The first large-scale shutdowns came just after February 10th. Electricity officials had warned the government that reserves were nearly exhausted. Industries were already operating under limited hours, but demand for domestic heating had overwhelmed the grid. Power stations could no longer function on the fuel available. The Ministry of Fuel and Power issued a nationwide order. Non-essential electricity would be cut. Factories without priority status would close. Commercial lighting would be banned, and households across Britain would lose power for hours at a time. Every day at first, Londoners assumed the cuts would be brief. The government had used rolling blackouts during the war, and the public was accustomed to disruption. But within hours, it became clear that this was not a short-term measure. Street lamps extinguished along major avenues. Shop windows went dark. Electric heaters fell silent in thousands of homes. The capital, which had imagined a future of peace and modern comfort, found itself slipping backward into cold and shadow. Radio silence became one of the most dramatic symbols of the crisis. The BBC was ordered to shorten broadcasting hours to conserve electricity. Popular programs disappeared from the schedule. Some days, the radio went off-air entirely. Families who once gathered each evening to listen to wartime updates or comedy broadcasts now stared at silent receivers. For many, this silence felt more unnerving than any statistic. The wireless had been a companion throughout the Blitz, unbroken even under bombardment. Its sudden absence signaled just how serious the crisis had become. Newspapers shrank to smaller formats as printing presses faced energy rationing. Publications were forced to cut page counts, photographs, and feature sections just to stay open. Editors apologized to readers, admitting there was not enough power to produce full editions. Even the Times, a paper that had printed through some of the darkest days of the war, had to reduce operations. London's factories and workshops shut down by the thousands. Industrial blackouts pushed millions of workers into temporary unemployment. Although some factories attempted to operate on limited hours, many simply closed, leaving employees unpaid and uncertain about their futures. Shipyards, textile mills, steel plants, and chemical work sectors that were central to Britain's post-war rebuilding plan were suddenly silent. Smokestacks that had symbolized progress were now reminders of a nation without fuel. For many families, the hardest part was the cold. Homes already damaged by wartime bombing were poorly insulated, and electricity had become a last defense against freezing rooms. With power cut, households depended entirely on coal fires, but coal deliveries continued to fall. As the crisis worsened, Britain imposed strict controls. Households were allowed only small, weekly quantities. Long lines formed outside coal merchants. Some Londoners waited hours only to be turned away when supplies ran out. Without heat, rooms became bitterly cold. Breath misted in the air indoors. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Families moved their mattresses into kitchens, pushing beds close to stoves and baking ovens. People wore multiple layers of clothing indoors, sometimes sleeping fully dressed. Britain prided itself on endurance, but the winter of 1947 tested even hardened wartime survivors. Public buildings suffered just as severely. Schools reduced hours or closed entirely because classrooms could not be heated. Teachers wrapped scarves around their faces to read lessons. Students kept coats and gloves on during lessons, but even that was not always enough. Medical reports described children fainting from cold and hunger. Many schools remained shut for weeks, forcing parents, many already out of work, to keep children at home. Hospitals, stretched thin by staff shortages and rationing, faced their own emergency. Surgeries were postponed because operating rooms could not maintain safe temperatures. Nurses warmed patients with hot bricks and water bottles when available, but supplies ran short. Reports of hypothermia among elderly patients increased. Ironically, hospitals also lacked power to run laundry services, pushing medical teams to reuse bedding and gowns far longer than was safe. London Underground stations, which had served as shelters during the Blitz, struggled to operate. Electric signals failed. Trains stalled in tunnels. Service interruptions left commuters stranded. Some stations turned into impromptu waiting areas where people gathered around whatever warmth they could find. Overground rail, already crippled by snow, faced even worse delays as power lines froze or failed entirely. Shops and businesses were required to turn off window lighting and display limited goods. Refrigeration systems shut down, pushing grocers to sell perishable food quickly or discard spoiled products. Butchers faced meat shortages. Bakers ran out of flour. The post-war promise of economic revival began to collapse under the pressure of darkness and hunger. The psychological effect was profound. For years, London had endured war with a sense of purpose. Citizens believed their sacrifices were necessary to defeat fascism. But in 1947, there was no enemy in the sky, no bombs falling, no invader to resist. The hardship felt random and cruel. Many asked how the country that had survived the Luftwaffe could not survive winter. Newspapers captured the frustration. Editorials criticized the government for mismanaging fuel reserves and failing to anticipate the depth of the crisis. Public anger focused on Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power. Once praised for his wartime leadership, he now faced accusations of incompetence. Crowds protested outside government buildings, holding signs demanding accountability. Shinwell received thousands of letters, some threatening. Parliament held crisis debates. The government defended its decisions, but confidence eroded steadily. British humour, which had helped carry the population through the war, thinned in the cold. Comedians on the BBC joked about frozen pipes and extinguished lamps, but the laughter was strained. Newspapers published cartoons of citizens wrapped like mummies against the cold. But many readers found little comfort in humour. Some cities appeared frozen in time. Photographs from February 1947 show central London nearly deserted at night. Buses crawled along slick roads under street lamps that barely glowed. Public squares that had once hosted victory celebrations after VE Day were empty and silent. It was as if the capital had slipped back into the wartime blackout, but this time without the unifying spirit of national defense. The crisis exposed how deeply modern Britain depended on electricity. In the 1930s, many homes still relied on coal fires alone. But by 1947, electric lighting, heating, and appliances were increasingly common. The public had begun to believe in a future of comfort and modern convenience. Losing electricity felt like losing progress itself. After victory in 1945, citizens imagined a nation moving forward into a new age of peace. Instead, they found themselves thrust backward. As factories closed and businesses shut their doors, unemployment soared. Men and women who had been confident about their futures now waited in ration queues, uncertain when work would return. Coal miners, who were laboring under dangerous and freezing conditions, became targets of public resentment despite their efforts. Some newspapers unfairly accused miners of laziness or sabotage. In reality, miners were producing as much coal as infrastructure could move, but the railways and ports simply could not carry it. The blackout also changed cultural life. Cinemas reduced showings or closed. Theatre productions were cancelled. Dance halls and pubs darkened before nightfall. Entertainment, once a small escape from everyday struggle, became rare. Without music, radio broadcasts, or warm gathering places, London grew quiet. Light and heat had been symbols of victory after the war. Street lamps shining on Westminster Bridge, theatres reopening in the West End, radios broadcasting music late into the evening. These were the markers of a return to normal life. Their disappearance hit morale as sharply as rationing or unemployment. Despite the hardship, Londoners adapted where they could. Some neighbourhoods organised shared meals in warmed community halls. Families pooled fuel when possible. Volunteers delivered blankets to the elderly and those living alone. Churches opened their doors as warming centres. The spirit of cooperation that had defined the Blitz flickered again, though this time without the same optimism. But the scale of the crisis meant personal efforts could only do so much. The weather remained relentlessly cold. Snow returned repeatedly, sometimes falling for days without pause. The ground hardened. Rivers froze. Power stations rationed every ton of coal. Government officials admitted privately that the nation was dangerously close to losing control of the electrical grid entirely. On February 24th, a slight thaw allowed limited railway movement. Coal finally reached major cities in larger quantities. Power outages continued, but for the first time in weeks, there was hope of relief. Yet London soon discovered that the crisis was far from over. As snow began melting from rooftops, streets, and farmland, another disaster formed. Rivers swelled, dams strained, and the country braced for floods that would bring destruction of a different kind. Lights had gone out. Heat had vanished. Factories had fallen silent. Britain, victorious in war, was shaken deeply in peace. And while the first signs of thaw brought temporary comfort, the winter of 1947 was preparing its next blow. Hunger had never disappeared after the war. Britain emerged from victory in 1945, still dependent on ration books and limited imports. But in the winter of 1947, food scarcity became a nationwide emergency. As coal shortages shut down transport networks, food supply chains collapsed with them. Fields froze, livestock died in extreme conditions, and goods could not move across the country. In London, shop shelves emptied with alarming speed. For many families, meals became smaller, less frequent, and in some cases, non-existent. Rationing had been part of British life since January 1940. During the war, every citizen received allotments of meat, sugar, butter, flour, and other staples. After peace returned, many assumed rationing would ease. Instead, it intensified. The British government had expected rapid recovery in agricultural and international trade, but post-war Europe was struggling with famine-level shortages. Entire regions of the continent had been devastated. Farm equipment was destroyed, livestock populations had plunged, and harvests were erratic. Britain depended on imported food, but global supply simply could not meet demand. The winter of 1947 made the situation far worse. By February, milk deliveries slowed to a trickle. Farms were buried in snow. Cows that could not be fed properly produced less milk. Many herds faced starvation conditions. Truck routes to cities were blocked, and even when livestock survived, there was no way to transport milk to bottling plants or urban distribution depots. Children who had once received daily milk rations in school now went without. Bread disappeared next. Britain had already been importing large quantities of wheat from Canada and the United States, but frozen ports and stalled railway lines prevented shipments from moving inland. Bakeries reduced output. Long queues formed at dawn outside neighborhood shops. Many people waited 2 or 3 hours in freezing temperatures only to discover the day's supply had run out. Meat shortages became even more severe. Livestock froze in fields across Britain. Farmers struggled to dig out sheep and cattle buried under snowdrifts. Poultry farms lost thousands of birds to cold temperatures. Even when meat arrived at butchers, it was often rationed in painfully small cuts. Housewives stood in line with ration books in hand, hoping to secure a few ounces, sometimes just enough to flavor a soup. The government faced a communications crisis. Feeding the population was a matter of national security, and ministers issued statements urging calm. But the public had grown wary of government assurances. They had been told repeatedly that peace would bring prosperity. Now they were being asked for patience while food grew scarcer than during parts of the war itself. In February, British newspapers began reporting on emergency rations and critical shortages. For the first time in peacetime Britain, starvation was openly discussed. Some of the most vivid accounts from 1947 came from ordinary citizens. Letters sent to local councils and newspapers expressed anger and desperation. Parents described children crying from hunger. Pensioners wrote about skipping meals so younger family members could eat. Diaries from the period document a steady decline in health, dizziness, weakness, constant fatigue. The winter cold magnified these symptoms. Without enough calories, the human body struggled to maintain warmth, and cases of hypothermia increased. Soup kitchens reopened across the capital. Some were run by churches, others by local governments or volunteers. Long lines stretched around blocks as people sought hot meals or warm tea. Reports from the time described families arriving just before closing hours, hoping leftovers remained. Organizations such as the Salvation Army distributed blankets, bread, and canned goods where they could. But supplies were limited. Milk rationing reached crisis levels by late February. Pregnant women and young children were meant to receive priority access, but deliveries were so sporadic that even priority vouchers were sometimes useless. London newspapers published photographs of mothers standing outside closed dairy shops holding empty bottles. In some districts, local authorities organized emergency deliveries using army vehicles. But demand always exceeded supply. Fresh vegetables and fruit vanished early in the crisis. Winter crops were frozen in the ground. Imported produce rotted on docks, while workers waited for electricity to power cranes and refrigeration equipment. Grocers offered what they could: a handful of onions, bruised apples, or tin-packed goods when available. Prices rose, though government controls kept them from spiraling. But for many families, even controlled prices were too high. Bread rationing became one of the most controversial policies of the entire post-war period. Britain had never rationed bread during the war itself. In 1946, the government introduced bread rationing to manage shortages. The policy remained deeply unpopular. By 1947, with bakeries unable to produce enough loaves and transport frozen across the country, ration limits tightened again. Citizens viewed it as a sign of national decline and acknowledgement that post-war prosperity was further away than ever. Schools tried to maintain feeding programs, but their own supplies dwindled. Teachers wrote accounts of children showing up without breakfast, hungry and unable to concentrate. Some schools shortened the day because students were too cold and too weak to stay in unheated classrooms. Government nutrition surveys later showed measurable drops in children's weight in communities hardest hit by food shortages. The British public had endured rationing for 7 years, believing it would end with the war. Instead, the winter of 1947 forced new restrictions. On March 2nd, the government announced additional ration cuts on bacon, fats, and canned goods. The timing was devastating. It arrived just when households were already struggling through the peak of the crisis. Public frustration reached a breaking point. Crowds gathered outside grocery shops, yelling for deliveries. Local newspapers printed stories of arguments in ration queues. In some areas, police were stationed near shops to prevent outbursts. There were isolated cases of food theft, though most reports involved petty crime loaves taken from delivery trucks, dried goods stolen from storage sheds, or eggs taken from farmyards. The government feared the unrest would grow. Prime Minister Clement Attlee addressed the House of Commons, urging calm and insisting the crisis would pass. But his speeches offered little immediate comfort. Members of the Conservative Party called for a relaxation of food exports. Some argued that sending food abroad while British families went hungry was indefensible, especially given the winter emergency. Labour ministers countered that Britain had an obligation to aid Allied nations rebuilding from war. The debate escalated into a bitter political fight. Meanwhile, food imports from overseas remained stuck. Ships carrying wheat from North America and meat from Australia reached British ports, but unloading them required machinery the winter had crippled. In some cases, entire shipments spoiled before they could reach processing factories. Foreign newspapers reported on Britain's struggles, noting with surprise that the nation that had stood victorious in 1945 was now fighting hunger. By late March, a gradual thaw began across the country. Snow melted from roads, rail lines reopened, and supply trucks moved again. But the thaw brought new problems. Flooding from swollen rivers destroyed farmland, ruined stored grain, and washed out rural roads. The government warned that food shortages would continue even as weather improved. For many, the hardest weeks of hunger came after the cold ended, when the country was still recovering from transport collapse. Even when food began moving again, ration levels did not immediately rise. Throughout spring 1947, the government maintained strict controls to rebuild stockpiles. Bread rationing continued until 1948. Meat and bacon remained limited. Into the early 1950s, many historians would later argue that the food crisis of 1947 marked the peak of post-war deprivation, the moment British civilians realized that peace would not bring instant relief, and yet, despite the hunger, the queues, and the daily struggle to feed families, there were no mass riots and no large-scale breakdown of order. British society, bruised but disciplined by wartime habits, endured through hardship. Churches continued charity meals. Housewives traded ration coupons and exchanged recipes for soups made from scraps. Farmers fought to restore livestock and salvage frozen crops. Doctors and social workers monitored malnutrition and urged the government to expand. Nutritional programs dot the winter revealed a truth that shocked many: Britain had survived the war. But peace brought its own dangers. Bombs had not emptied cupboards or frozen fields. But hunger proved just as powerful an enemy. For the first time since the Blitz, the nation became aware of how thin the line between survival and crisis had become by the end of 1947. Britain began to rebuild its food network with help from international aid and domestic recovery. But the memory of that winter and the empty stomachs it left behind remained long after the snow melted. Children had endured the Second World War in evacuation trains, underground shelters, and classrooms lit by blackout curtains. But by 1947, many believed the worst was behind them. They had returned to their neighborhoods, their schools, and a life that was supposed to resemble normality. Instead, the winter delivered a crisis that pushed young people into some of the harshest conditions Britain had faced in peacetime. When the snowstorms settled over London in February, schools struggled to operate. Heating systems failed as coal supplies ran out. Classrooms built with thin wartime materials became frigid environments. Teachers arrived each morning to find ink frozen in inkwells and frost covering the insides of windows. Some schools reported indoor temperatures only a few degrees above freezing. Children sat at wooden desks wearing coats, hats, and gloves, breathing air so cold that their breath lingered in clouds. The Ministry of Education issued instructions urging schools to remain open whenever possible. The government feared that widespread closures would leave children unsupervised in dangerous winter conditions. But maintaining regular lessons became nearly impossible. Barnet, Hackney, Lambeth, and dozens of boroughs across London shortened school days because students were too cold to stay for full schedules. At times, pupils huddled around small coal stoves placed inside classrooms. But even those stoves burned out quickly as coal rations tightened. Teachers improvised. Some instructed students to march in place or do light exercises at their desks to keep warm. Others rotated children in groups near the only source of heat, the school oven. The cold created new educational challenges. Pencils snapped more easily, paper stiffened, and children struggled to focus while shivering. The hunger crisis made everything worse. Rationing had already stretched diets to their limits. When food supplies dwindled further, children showed obvious physical effects. School nurses reported cases of dizziness and fainting. Some students arrived without breakfast, and many had gone to bed the night before without a meal. In the hardest hit districts, teachers kept emergency biscuits or bread in their desks for children who showed signs of weakness. For years, the British government had promoted free school meals and milk distribution as a way to protect child health. But the winter disrupted both systems. Milk deliveries stalled when dairy trucks could not reach cities. Some schools served watered-down soups, stews bulked with barley or potatoes, or bread soaked in broth. Even these small meals were often insufficient. Not every school could continue. Some buildings were shut indefinitely because heating systems froze or pipes burst, flooding corridors with water that immediately turned to ice. Teachers held lessons in church halls, libraries, or private homes when space allowed. In rural areas, where schools were sometimes miles apart, children simply stayed home because roads were impassable. Education during the winter became unpredictable day to day, decision rather than a routine. Hardship bred acts of resilience. Teachers wrote reports of students sharing lunches, passing biscuits quietly to classmates who had nothing. Parent-teacher associations organized collection drives for warm clothing. Some families exchanged outgrown coats and boots, so younger children would not face the cold barefoot or underdressed. In mining regions, communities rallied to provide food parcels for school kitchens. Efforts were small, but they kept many children afloat. Government messaging during the winter reflected a grim reality. By mid-February, coal supplies for schools were almost gone. The Ministry of Fuel and Power issued a controversial plea. Parents should not burn school property to keep their homes warm. In some towns, desks, chairs, and wooden floorboards had already been removed or destroyed. The government feared widespread damage, would delay education even further once winter passed. Local authorities faced difficult moral choices. Should they keep a school open, knowing children would be cold? Or should they send students home, where conditions might be even worse? Head teachers weighed the risks daily. In some places, teachers held classes in the single warmest room in the building, crowding dozens of students together. In others, schools closed temporarily. Posting, handwritten notices on doors explaining that heat had run out. Health consequences mounted. Doctors monitoring child welfare reported weight loss across multiple regions. Respiratory illnesses spread in cold classrooms, especially among the youngest pupils. Cases of bronchitis and pneumonia rose. Hospitals, already struggling to stay warm, admitted children weakened by hunger and exposure. Medical officers filed reports to Parliament, stating that child health had deteriorated to its worst point since wartime. Some of the clearest testimonies come from diaries, letters, and interviews recorded later in life. Former students remembered sitting in classrooms with blankets across their knees. Others recalled ration meals that consisted of a thin slice of bread and watered cocoa. A schoolgirl in South London later described writing lessons wearing mittens because her fingers stung in the cold. A boy from the Midlands recounted the embarrassment of fainting during morning prayer because he had not eaten since midday. The day before, teachers were among the unsung figures of the winter. Many walked miles through snow because buses were cancelled or frozen in depots. They conducted lessons in unheated rooms, their voices trembling from cold. Some brought small pieces of coal from their own homes to keep school stoves burning. Social workers coordinated food deliveries to the poorest families, often traveling door to door with ration coupons and emergency supplies. The blackout of radio broadcasts affected children as well. Programs designed for students' educational lectures and school music hours were cancelled. At home, evenings in the dark left little for young people to do except sit quietly or go to bed early. Schools that normally offered clubs, sports, or music were forced to suspend them. Childhood during the winter of 1947 became narrow and confined. Despite the hardship, there were rare moments of relief. When snow finally stopped falling, some schools encouraged children to spend time outdoors, believing exercise would keep them warm. In playgrounds buried under drifts, students built snow figures and forts, an echo of normal childhood joy. But joy seldom lasted long. Once playtime ended, pupils returned to freezing classrooms and empty lunch tables. As the thaw began in March, schools faced the consequences of the long freeze. Buried pipes burst across the capital, flooding basements and destroying supplies. Furniture damaged by makeshift fires needed to be replaced. Broken windows, cracked plaster, and mold spread through poorly heated buildings. Many schools required extensive repairs. Before normal teaching could resume, the government acknowledged the immense strain children had endured. Reports from the Board of Education warned that nutritional conditions were below recommended standards. Discussions began about expanding school milk and meal programs, when supplies recovered. But immediate relief was limited. Britain's food and fuel networks needed months to rebuild. The lasting psychological effect on children became evident in later surveys. Many who lived through the winter recalled the cold more vividly than wartime bombing. Hunger, cold classrooms, and the sight of parents struggling left marks on memory. For a generation raised under rationing, the winter represented both the end of wartime fear and the beginning of peacetime hardship. Yet there was resilience. Schools reopened. Lessons resumed. Children returned to normal academic routines as ration books continued dictating meals. Britain did not lose a generation to the winter, but it came closer than the government ever anticipated. By summer 1947, children played in warm streets again. Milk returned to canteens. Flooded fields recovered enough to support new crops. But the nation did not forget how close hunger had crept her, how vulnerable the youngest citizens had been. The winter of 1947 proved that survival was more than victory in war. It required food, fuel, and the infrastructure of daily life. And when that infrastructure collapsed, it was children who suffered most. The River Thames had witnessed centuries of British history fathers, coronations, plague ships, trade, war, and celebration. But in early 1947, it became the stage for a spectacle that few modern Londoners had ever seen. As temperatures dropped week after week, ice formed along the riverbanks. At first, it clung in narrow ribbons, gathering against jetties and pilings. Then the frost thickened, spreading outward from shore until large sections of the Thames began to seize under the weight of an unrelenting winter. For most of the 20th century, the Thames had been too wide, too tidal, and too industrial to freeze solid. Steamships, barges, and tugboats moved constantly along the channel, and warm water from factories, power stations, and sewage outflows helped keep the river fluid, even in cold spells. But 1947 was different. Electric power stations burned too little coal to generate waste heat. Factories ran at reduced capacity or shut entirely. Barges sat motionless along quays. The tides still rose and fell, but ice formed faster than water could break it apart. By February, reports of freezing came from Kingston, Richmond, and Teddington. Canals feeding into the Thames had already turned to solid sheets. Barges in narrow waterways were locked in place, their hulls surrounded by thick ice. In some stretches, boatmen abandoned their vessels until thaw returned. Photographs from the period show long rows of barges frozen bow to stern, looking like scars across a whitened river. Ice floes drifted downstream, gathering in clusters under bridges. At Lambeth and Westminster, workers used long poles to break apart ice threatening to jam against piers. But the cold was persistent. Each night, any progress made during the day was undone by temperatures dropping well below freezing. The river, always in motion, now appeared still its surface, marked by frozen ripples along the edges. As if a windstorm had been captured and preserved in ice. Public fascination grew. Crowds gathered along embankments to stare at the spectacle. The river that powered London's commerce had been tamed by winter. Newspapers published photographs of ice stretching outward from the banks, dotted with trapped debris branches, wooden crates, ropes, bottles frozen in place. Some Londoners compared the scene to paintings from the 17th century, when the Thames froze so solidly that frost fairs were held on its surface. But the river in 1947 never froze that completely. Freezing occurred in long patches, on shallow edges, and at piers still remarkable. but too unstable for crowds to walk upon. London's underground rivers suffered more dramatically. These concealed waterways, many converted into sewers or storm channels in the 19th century, could not be seen by the public. But the cold plunged into soil and masonry, freezing water in tunnels and culverts beneath the city. In some places, ice blocked drainage systems, causing backups that flooded cellars and roadways when temperatures briefly rose. Engineers worked day and night clearing ice from Victorian brick shafts never designed to withstand sub-zero conditions for weeks on end. Small tributaries feeding the Thames froze most completely. The River Lee, which flowed through East London and served as a vital industrial artery, turned to thick ice. Barges carrying grain, coal, and manufactured goods halted. Workers climbed across frozen surfaces to inspect hulls and unload cargo by hand, an improvised solution that slowed transport to a crawl. Canals in Camden, Paddington, and Limehouse formed solid sheets, turning towpaths into quiet corridors of snow where horses and bargemen once moved daily, at docks and wharves. The freeze brought commerce to a standstill. Cargo that arrived from overseas ships could not be pushed inland. Cranes could not swing freely in cold winds, and frozen ropes snapped under tension. Warehouses filled with goods, while shops in the city centre remained empty. In some cases, food shipments sat just a few miles from markets but could not be transferred. The Thames was a natural highway, and when the highway froze, London's supply network jammed. Power stations along the river struggled. Coal shortages had already pushed them to crisis, and the freezing water added new complications. Power stations used Thames water for cooling. When intake pipes froze or clogged with ice, generators shut down. Engineers kept boats near intakes to break the surface, hacking open channels in the ice so water could flow. But manpower alone could not overcome a winter of such scale. Each night the river froze again. The sight of ice on the Thames carried an emotional weight for Londoners. The river had always symbolized movement of goods, people, and time. Now it appeared paralyzed. Some compared the freeze to wartime, another moment when London was brought to its knees. During the Blitz, the Thames had reflected burning docks and shipyards. In 1947, it mirrored silence. Freezing rivers and canals also caused practical emergencies. Fire brigades found it difficult to draw water for hoses. Boats used for river rescue could not reach emergencies. When warehouses caught fire in February, firefighters battled flames without reliable access to water, smashing ice with axes to reach liquid beneath. Reports describe crews pumping slush rather than water, a nearly useless effort in a major blaze. Even below-ground infrastructure suffered. Pipes buried in soil froze and burst across the city. Water mains cracked, flooding streets that instantly turned to sheets of ice. Repair crews, already stretched by wartime shortages, worked in freezing conditions to contain leaks. When water pressure dropped, some neighborhoods lost access entirely, forcing households to collect snow and melt it for washing. The freeze also affected locks and weirs. Mechanical gates jammed under ice. River traffic that could have resumed on warmer days remained halted because lock edges were frozen solid. Engineers feared structural damage if pressure built beneath slabs of ice. In smaller rivers, fish suffocated under frozen surfaces, washing up along banks in the first weak thaw. Scientists and meteorologists documented the event in detail. Measurements at Teddington Lock, a key gauge point for tidal Thames conditions, recorded some of the lowest water temperatures in living memory. Ice thickness reached several inches near edges and in sheltered inlets. Nowhere in central London was the river safely walkable. The extent of freezing was unmatched since the 19th century. Photographs from the period show the Thames transformed into a sculptural landscape. Ice piled into jagged ridges where flows collided. Snow dusted the surface with white streaks. Mooring posts and boats appeared embedded in a frozen skin, stretching dozens of meters from the bank. On foggy mornings, the river vanished into a blur of white and smoke, making it difficult to distinguish water from land. For a brief time, London looked almost Arctic. Alongside the visual spectacle came economic damage. The Port of London, one of the busiest in the world, could not function normally. Tugs trapped in ice could not guide freighters to berths. Coal shipments, already desperately needed, sat idle on anchored ships. Dockworkers, already facing layoffs from power cuts, now had no cargo to unload. Thousands lost wages in a winter already defined by scarcity. If the Thames was symbolic of national paralysis, the freezing of the city's smaller waterways revealed the hidden complexity of London's infrastructure. The river fleet, long buried beneath the streets, flooded stretches of Holborn and Clerkenwell when underground ice blocked its flow. The Westbourne overflowed near Paddington. Engineers traced water seepage into railway tunnels where ice formed on tracks and signals. On the surface, buses avoided routes where water mains had burst, leaving slick, dangerous patches. For Londoners, the freeze became part of daily conversation. Newspapers printed photographs of barges locked in place and bridges with ice clinging beneath their arches. Commentary ranged from fascination to fear. Some older residents recalled historic frost fairs, when the river froze solid and people set up stalls, games, and bonfires on its surface. But no such festivities were possible in 1947. Conditions were too unstable and the mood of the nation too strained. Still, the visual transformation was unforgettable. Nature had forced London to pause. The river that had carried the materials of war and peace now lay immobile. Snow piled along embankments. Ice stretched between boats. Tug captains walked across decks that had not moved for weeks. The Thames carrier of empire, trade, and history had fallen silent, and yet, beneath the ice, the river was not dead. Tides continued to rise and fall, pushing against frozen surfaces. Currents nudged flows and cracked open seams. Engineers noted that the river never surrendered fully. It merely waited for temperatures to rise. When the thaw finally came in March, the change was sudden. Ice broke apart into huge sheets, moving with the tide and colliding with piers. Some barges were damaged. Bridges shed chunks of frozen buildup. Canals reopened gradually as snow melted and ice thinned. But the thaw brought floods. Vast stretches of farmland, already saturated with melted snow, could not absorb the volume of water. Rivers spilled over banks, filling fields, roads, and villages. The freeze had been destructive. The thaw was worse. London looked upon the returning flow of the Thames with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Water moved again, freeing ships and restoring the possibility of trade. But the ice had left scars, damaged boats, weakened piers, burst pipes, and disrupted sewage channels that would take months to repair. The winter of 1947 left the Thames changed, if only temporarily. It became a reminder that even in a modern industrial capital, nature could overpower engineering. Barges stuck in ice became symbols of a country frozen into immobility, factories silent. Transport halted, lights out, and hunger spreading. The river that usually marked the heartbeat of the city reflected a nation struggling to endure one of the most brutal winters in its history. As the winter of 1947 tightened its grip, Britain discovered that when legal supply chains failed, illegal ones emerged to take their place. Hunger and cold pushed ordinary people toward desperate decisions. Rationing, once tolerated as a patriotic duty, now became a burden too heavy for many to carry. When coal bins emptied and food shops closed with bare shelves, the black market already present during the war expanded into one of the only functioning networks in the country. Police records and contemporary newspapers document a sudden rise in thefts, smuggling, and unlicensed trading. Coal became the most stolen commodity in Britain. Railway wagons filled with coal sat immobile, frozen on tracks across the Midlands and northern England. With trains unable to move, open wagons stood for days or weeks in snowbound sidings. Under cover of darkness, men and boys climbed into the wagons, filling sacks with whatever coal they could reach. Some worked alone, others in groups that moved from yard to yard, carrying fuel to neighbourhoods where coal had vanished completely. In London, merchants reported missing coal deliveries almost daily. Lorries that reached the outskirts of the city were swarmed by desperate residents. Drivers had to push through crowds or be forced to turn back. Coal yards posted guards. Some depots installed wooden barricades and barbed wire defensive measures unseen in peacetime. In mining towns, lorries travelling from pitheads to rail depots were ambushed by thieves, who grabbed small sacks of fuel before drivers could intervene. Many of these thieves were unemployed workers or fathers trying to heat family homes. Police sometimes arrested them. Other times, officers turned a blind eye, recognizing that the line between crime and survival had blurred. The black market moved quickly to fill the void. Coal sold illegally in back alleys, pubs, and private houses cost far more than the fixed government price. Bags were passed hand to hand in unlit courtyards or delivered late at night to avoid detection. Some buyers were households with no other option. Others were shopkeepers who needed heat to keep their businesses open. Food theft rose just as sharply. Milk vans were frequent targets. Drivers delivering in the early morning hours found bottles missing from doorsteps before families woke. Dairy depots were raided by thieves who broke through frozen gates to steal cartons and butter. In rural areas, farmers reported eggs and poultry disappearing from barns. Some cases were isolated acts of hunger. Others were organized operations supplying illegal food sellers. Urban markets saw a surge of unlicensed traders. They operated from carts, barrows, or temporary stalls hidden in side streets. Some sold legitimate goods purchased at inflated prices. Others offered items stolen directly from warehouses or transport depots. Bread, sugar, tinned food, and butter were especially valuable. A single loaf fetched several times its rationed cost. Word spread quickly when a seller appeared, and crowds gathered until police dispersed them. Authorities attempted to control the black market with a mix of enforcement and public appeals. Newspapers printed warnings that anyone caught buying or selling rationed goods illegally faced fines or imprisonment. Police made raids, seized goods, and arrested offenders. Courts processed theft cases daily, issuing penalties meant to deter further crime. But enforcement was limited by manpower, weather, and public sympathy for those involved. In the darkest weeks of February, police faced more demands than they could meet. Officers were required to patrol ration lines, supervise coal yards, direct traffic on icy roads, and respond to emergencies caused by freezing pipes and power failures. Many stations reported staff shortages as officers themselves fell ill from the cold. Under those conditions, organized black market networks flourished. Illicit slaughtering of livestock became another problem. Farmers too desperate to feed animals sold them unofficially to underground butchers. Without refrigeration, meat had to be distributed quickly, often in poor sanitary conditions. Health inspectors reported cases of contaminated meat circulating through illegal markets, adding disease risk to a population already weakened by hunger and winter illness. Along London's docks, the black market took on a different scale. Imported, rationed goods, dried milk, canned meats, sugar, tea sat in warehouses waiting for transport to processing plants or shops. When dock work slowed due to power cuts, some goods were siphoned off by criminal groups. Police patrols increased, but theft continued. Rumors spread that certain products were available only under the counter and at high prices. Workers inside the legitimate food system sometimes became part of illegal networks. Some grocers quietly saved food for regular customers who paid in cash rather than ration coupons. Market inspectors discovered bakers mixing illegal flour with legal supplies to increase production. Employees in government depots siphoned small amounts of food each day, believing it justified by their families' needs to the government. Black market crime represented an attack on post-war recovery. To many ordinary citizens, it was a symptom of survival. The vast majority of British people obeyed rationing laws, even during the worst of the crisis. But desperation made the system fragile. Every theft or illegal purchase weakened confidence that the state could protect its citizens from hunger. Tension grew. Those who obeyed the rules resented those who broke them. Letters to newspapers complained that criminals were rewarded while law-abiding citizens suffered. Some argued that rationing was pointless if goods moved freely on the black market. Others called for heavier punishment for thieves. At the same time, sympathy for offenders was common. Many families understood too well that hunger could drive a person to steal. Ministers debated how to respond. Fuel Minister Emmanuel Shinwell urged police to increase patrols around energy depots. The Ministry of Food carried out inspections of shops suspected of illegal trading. Courts imposed sentences ranging from fines to weeks or months in prison. But these actions did little to slow the growth of the underground economy. The black market existed because legal supply had collapsed. Without restoring coal and food deliveries, enforcement alone could not solve the problem. Newspapers covered the black market with a mix of condemnation and reluctant fascination. Stories described raids, arrests, and dramatic chases across snow-covered streets. Some papers sensationalized crime to divert attention from government failures. Others published editorials arguing that the black market was a direct result of poor planning, insufficient stockpiling, and delayed imports. Despite the drama, the scale of black market activity was a sign of how thinly stretched British society had become. The same streets that had endured air raids now saw households scavenging for scraps. In one example recorded by local councils, a group of parents collected fallen coal pieces from railway embankments and broke them down with hammers to heat a school classroom. Officially, this was theft. Practically, it was the only way to keep children warm. There were also cases more extreme. Reports emerged of families tearing apart abandoned buildings for fuel, pulling out floorboards, doors, and beams. Some homeowners found their garden fences missing cut down and carried away for firewood. In certain towns, entire allotments were stripped of sheds, gates, and tool handles. Every piece of wood became potential heat. Authorities begged communities not to destroy public property. In one widely publicized appeal, the Ministry of Education urged parents not to break up school furniture for fuel. Some classrooms had already lost desks, benches, and wooden dividers. The damage would take years to repair. For police, the crisis posed moral dilemmas. An officer watching a man steal coal knew the theft was illegal. He also knew the man's family might be freezing at home. Some officers issued warnings instead of arrests. Others confiscated stolen fuel and redistributed it to elderly residents rather than returning it to warehouses. Law was enforced, but humanity intervened wherever possible. By March, as thaw began, black market activity started to slow. Roads reopened. Trains moved again. Coal deliveries resumed. Food began to flow back into shops. The government intensified enforcement, cutting off illegal supply chains and prosecuting more offenders. Some networks dissolved as soon as legal goods reappeared. Others lingered, continuing into the early 1950s, when rationing was still in effect. Historians studying the winter of 1947 emphasize that Britain did not descend into chaos. The overwhelming majority of citizens followed rationing rules even under severe duress. But the black market revealed a painful truth. When systems collapse, survival becomes a negotiable concept. The law was designed for stability. The winter offered only crisis. In the aftermath, government inquiries highlighted the need for stronger reserve stockpiles, better transport planning, and improved distribution networks. But for those who lived through the winter, the memory remained personal. The sight of coal disappearing from their bins, empty bread shelves, or neighbors slipping quietly home with food bought illegally. The black market had not emerged from greed. It emerged from cold hands and empty stomachs. And while it faded with the thaw, the winter of 1947 left a lesson that Britain would not forget. Modern society was only as stable as the supply lines that kept it warm and fed. Hospitals were the last institutions anyone expected to fail. During the war, they had worked under bombardment, treating casualties even as windows shattered and roofs burned. But in the winter of 1947, Britain's hospitals faced a different enemy, an enemy that offered no sirens, no warnings, only relentless cold and shortages that crept through their corridors. By February, medical facilities in London and beyond were barely functioning. Coal deliveries had slowed to a fraction of normal requirements. Power stations supplying hospitals lost generating capacity. Heating systems sputtered, then went silent. Buildings already damaged from wartime neglect could not retain warmth. Ward temperatures dropped below safe levels, and icy drafts crept through broken panes that had never been fully repaired since the Blitz. Nurses layered patients in blankets, but blankets alone were not enough. Medical reports from the time describe wards where frost formed on bed rails. Patients breathed clouds of condensation. Some elderly and chronically ill patients slipped into hypothermia in rooms meant for recovery. To replace heating, hospitals turned to old methods, placing heated bricks or hot water bottles under blankets, rotating them from bed to bed. Supplies of fuel for sterilizing equipment and warming wards were so limited that staff sometimes saved heat for operating theaters alone. Operations became a critical point of failure. Cold converted surgical rooms into unsafe environments. Sterilization equipment did not reach required temperatures. Lighting flickered or dimmed during power cuts. Elective surgeries were cancelled nationwide. Only emergency operations continued, and even those were performed under extreme strain. Doctors described trying to steady their hands while shivering through procedures. In several hospitals, surgeons worked in heavy coats, scarves, or gloves with the fingertips cut open. Shortages of food and fuel affected hospital kitchens as well. Patients recovering from illness or injury received meager meals, thin soups, watered vegetables, bread, and occasional cuts of meat. Dietitians reported caloric intake far below recommended levels, especially for children and the elderly. Nurses, already exhausted, reported feeling faint from hunger during shifts. Some hospitals received emergency food deliveries from local farmers or charity groups, but these supplies were unpredictable. Particularly vulnerable were maternity wards and pediatric hospitals. Newborn infants needed warmth to survive. Without heat, mortality risks rose. Hospitals placed multiple babies in shared cots or boxes lined with newspapers to trap warmth. Some pediatric departments moved children into the warmest rooms, often kitchens or boiler rooms, simply to keep them alive. Mothers recovering from childbirth slept in coats, turning hospital beds into makeshift shelters against the cold. The National Health Service did not yet exist. Britain's hospitals were a patchwork of municipal, voluntary, and military institutions. Their resources varied dramatically. Wealthier hospitals coped somewhat better, but smaller facilities in rural areas came close to collapse. Coal rations for hospitals were supposed to be protected, but the system failed repeatedly. Trucks loaded with fuel could not reach destinations. Some hospital administrators negotiated directly with railway officers, begging for priority. Others sent staff to collect coal by hand from nearby depots. The crisis exposed fragile supply lines. Pharmaceutical deliveries were delayed when trains stalled in snow. Blood storage units experienced electrical failures, destroying badly needed transfusion stores. Ambulances struggled on icy roads, forcing some hospitals to rely on volunteers with private cars or horse-drawn carts to move patients. At times, hospital generators failed, leaving wards lit only by lanterns and candles, the same methods used centuries earlier. Infectious disease control weakened. Cold wards and inadequate sanitation increased the risk of pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis. Medical officers issued warnings to local councils. Mortality would rise if conditions continued. Tuberculosis sanatoriums, which relied on fresh air therapy but required warmth between sessions, had to change treatment schedules. Patients were confined indoors, where overcrowding risked spreading disease further. Nurses and doctors worked through exhaustion. Many traveled long distances on foot when public transport failed. Some slept on hospital floors rather than walk home at night. Their uniforms provided little protection from the cold, and ward rounds became physical tests of endurance. Despite hardships, staff rarely abandoned their posts. Wartime discipline endured in peacetime emergency. Morale, however, suffered. In diaries and letters, medical workers recorded frustration at the government's inability to supply basic fuel. One nurse at a London infirmary wrote that she had never felt so helpless, not even during the Blitz. During the war, there had been purpose and unity. In 1947, there was only slow, grinding hardship. Public appeals for emergency aid grew urgent. Newspaper editorials demanded priority coal shipments for hospitals. Charitable organizations collected blankets, clothing, and hot water bottles. Some communities organized drives to donate fuel directly. Coal merchants, despite shortages, set aside small reserves for local medical facilities. These efforts saved lives, but they were inadequate against the scale of the crisis. The moral weight of the situation pressed heavily on medical staff. How does a city care for its sick when there is almost nothing left to give? Doctors faced decisions that should never occur outside of wartime: which patients received limited food, which wards stayed heated when fuel arrived, which operations continued and which were postponed. Every choice risked life or death. Cold weather also struck at mental hospitals and elderly care homes. These institutions, often on the edge of city centers, saw some of the worst suffering. Residents already weakened by age or illness had little defense against the cold. Care workers reported cases of frostbite, malnutrition, and respiratory failure. Many elderly patients died quietly in their beds, too frail to withstand the freezing nights. The government understood the seriousness of the situation but had no quick solution. Emergency fuel was diverted from factories to hospitals, yet there was not enough to go around. Parliament received reports of rising hospital deaths and worsening child health. Some MPs argued that the health crisis was more dangerous than unemployment or industrial shutdowns. But even political pressure could not thaw frozen coal mines or reopen blocked railway lines. In March, the thaw began. With it came new problems: floods, damaged buildings, and outbreaks of cold-related illness. Hospitals that had survived the freeze now faced water invasion from burst pipes and overflowing rivers. Some wards had to be evacuated as melted snow seeped into basements and treatment rooms. Medical teams treated frostbite victims, malnourished children, and elderly patients weakened by weeks of exposure. Only when coal and food distribution stabilized did hospital conditions begin to improve. Operations resumed. Kitchens regained supplies. Wards warmed for the first time in months. The worst had passed, but the scars remained. Hospital administrators compiled reports detailing equipment damaged by frost, heating systems in need of replacement, and medical stockpiles stretched beyond capacity. In the aftermath, the winter of 1947 became a key argument for building a stronger, centralized health system. The National Health Service was established 1 year later. In July 1948, some historians note that the memory of hospital collapse during the winter helped support public acceptance of a nationalized medical system. The crisis demonstrated that healthcare, as a patchwork of independent institutions, was dangerously vulnerable. For those who lived through it, the images never faded. Nurses tucking heated bricks into beds, surgeons working in coats, patients breathing into cold air that misted above them. The winter showed that a modern city, even one triumphant in war, could be brought to its knees by nature and scarcity. And it asked a painful question: how does a society protect its weakest citizens when even hospitals are on the brink of failure? Britain survived, but only narrowly. The hospitals of 1947 carried the nation through the crisis with determination, improvisation, and a level of sacrifice that history often overlooks. Behind every statistic of the winter stands a doctor who kept operating, a nurse who refused to go home, and a patient who endured when endurance seemed impossible. By early February 1947, Britain's economy had begun to resemble a machine slowly grinding to a halt. Trains that normally carried coal, food, and industrial goods across the country stood motionless in snowbound yards. Factories that had powered wartime production and post-war recovery shut their gates. For the first time in modern British history, the nation faced the possibility of total industrial paralysis. Rail transport was the backbone of Britain's economy. Almost every major factory depended on coal delivered by train. Power stations relied on rail wagons filled with fuel. Food supplies moved by locomotive from rural farms to urban markets. But the winter rendered this system nearly useless. Deep snow-covered tracks across the Midlands, northern England and Wales. Snowdrifts piled so high that signals, crossings and trackside buildings disappeared from view. Steam engines that attempted to push through the drifts stalled and froze on open lines. Some were abandoned where they stopped. Their boilers iced solid. Railway workers, many veterans of the war, fought back with shovels, picks and hand-operated snow. Crews laboured in freezing winds to clear points and switches frozen solid in ice. In some areas, teams dug through drifts taller than their own height, but every hour spent clearing was undone by the next snowfall. The storm fronts kept coming, one after another. No sooner had a line opened than another closed. Coal wagons sat immobilized in sidings, exposed to the snow and wind. The coal inside them froze. Workers trying to unload fuel found lumps fused together like stone. Deliveries that did reach power stations were sometimes useless until thawed with steam jets or hand tools. Railway administrators reported that trains were stacked across the country, unable to move either forward or backward. On some lines, as many as 1,000 wagons were stranded at once. As the trains froze, factories went dark. Britain had entered the post-war era, promising reconstruction, new homes, new infrastructure, and new consumer goods after years of rationing. But by February, industrial production collapsed. The government imposed emergency power bans on non-essential industries. Steel mills shut down their furnaces. Textile mills closed their looms. Chemical plants ran out of steam power. Car manufacturers, still transitioning from wartime weapons production, closed gates indefinitely. Hundreds of thousands of workers were laid off. Many had never faced unemployment before. During the war, factories ran around the clock. Every skilled hand was needed. Now, workers went home with no pay and no guarantee of return. Coal shortages meant they could not warm their households. Food shortages meant dinner tables remained nearly empty. A laid-off worker could not even rely on public transport to search for other jobs. The buses and trams ran sporadically, and train travel was unreliable. The clothing and textile industry suffered some of the greatest losses. Mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire depended on constant heat and power to run machinery. Without electricity, factories froze. Worsted and cotton mills closed by the hundreds. Looms stood silent. Textiles that had been destined for export markets piled up unfinished. Britain needed these exports desperately. After the war, the nation relied on foreign trade to rebuild its economy and repay wartime debts. Every day that factories lay silent pushed Britain deeper into financial crisis. In shipyards along the Tyne, Clyde, and Mersey, workers attempted to continue building merchant vessels and repairs for the Royal Navy, but welders could not work safely in heavy frost. Steel plates contracted in freezing temperatures, making them brittle. Dry docks filled with snow and ice. Some shipyards closed entirely, sending skilled labourers home and halting critical maritime production. Mining communities faced their own paradox. The nation needed coal more than ever, yet the mines themselves were crippled by cold. Machinery jammed. Pumps froze. Underground passages flooded and Mining output dropped sharply just as demand peaked. Railways could not move the coal that was produced. Britain watched the crisis unfold with growing fear. Newspapers printed photographs of empty factories, silent cranes, and workers queuing outside unemployment offices. Commentators warned that if production did not resume soon, the economy could collapse. The country had survived the bombings of the Blitz, but the winter threatened to destroy it from within. Quietly and relentlessly, the electricity shortage deepened the paralysis. With coal undelivered and power stations idled, the government ordered a full shutdown of electricity to industrial users. Businesses were given no choice: close or operate in the dark without heat. The ban affected over 20,000 factories and workshops. Even small businesses, tailors, printers, bakeries, were forced to stop work. Many never reopened. The cultural shock was profound. During the war, Britain's factories produced aircraft, tanks, ships, and munitions at a historic scale. Industry had been a symbol of national strength. In 1947, empty factories symbolized fragility. The hum of machinery, once constant, disappeared. Streets near industrial districts fell silent. Power cuts reached into daily life. Cinemas closed. Pubs shortened hours. Bakeries, lacking heat for ovens, could not bake bread. Laundry services could not run boilers. Ice formed inside warehouses where stored goods frosted over. Milk depots dumped thousands of gallons of spoiled milk because refrigeration had failed and transport was frozen. Economic anxiety spread. Workers without pay worried about rent. Shop owners, with no customers, feared bankruptcy. Farmers could not get machinery parts or fuel. The government introduced emergency benefits for unemployed workers, but paperwork delayed payments. Families lived off shrinking savings or ration coupons. Financial markets reacted. Britain's pound weakened. International observers questioned whether the nation could recover from both wartime debt and the winter crisis. The United States and Canada, Britain's major suppliers of wheat and fuel, sent emergency shipments. But icy ports and silent railways prevented rapid distribution. Public confidence in the government eroded. The Labour government under Prime Minister Clement Attlee had promised prosperity and modern reconstruction. Instead, citizens saw darkness, unemployment, and hunger. Critics asked how a nation capable of defeating Nazi Germany could not manage its own coal supply. Some cities attempted last resort measures. Local councils organized volunteer crews to dig out rail lines. In parts of Scotland and Wales, farmers used tractors and horses to clear tracks when machinery failed. Military units assisted railway clearing and coal hauling, treating the crisis with the same urgency as wartime logistics. But the progress was slow. Snow continued to fall. The fear of total national failure became real in mid-February. Economists warned that if coal and transport did not resume soon, Britain's industrial base could take years to rebuild. With factories shut and exports halted, foreign currency reserves dwindled. The government contemplated rationing electricity for households as well as industry, a measure that would have plunged entire cities into prolonged darkness. Some factories adapted. A handful of workshops turned to manual tools, producing goods by hand. Others burned whatever fuel they could obtain, wood scrap or fuel oil. But even these efforts provided only partial relief. Britain was an industrial nation. Without power, its economy could not function. As weeks passed, the cost became staggering. Historians estimate that the winter of 1947 caused one of the largest peacetime economic losses in modern British history. Production fell by nearly half in some sectors. Export contracts were cancelled. Infrastructure suffered damage that required months of repair. Equipment destroyed by frost had to be replaced. The financial impact lasted long after the snow melted. Yet, even at the lowest point, Britain did not collapse. Rail workers continued clearing lines. Miners continued producing coal under brutal conditions. Engineers worked night shifts to repair power stations. When a slow thaw began in late February and early March, trains moved again, first in short, delayed runs, then in longer convoys. Coal deliveries resumed. Power stations returned to life. Factories restarted machinery, though often cautiously, with limited output. The nation emerged, battered but functioning. Industrial employment resumed. Export shipments restarted. Britain avoided the total paralysis that some had feared. Still, the memory of those weeks lingered. For many workers, it was the first time after the war that unemployment had returned. For industrial managers, it exposed how vulnerable the economy was to disruptions in fuel and transport. The winter of 1947 forced a national reckoning. Britain could no longer assume that victory in war guaranteed stability in peace. The crisis highlighted the need for better stockpiling, modernized rail infrastructure, and diversified energy sources. In later decades, the government invested heavily in diesel locomotives, improved track heating, and modern power systems changes, partly inspired by the failures of 1947 to those who lived through it. The sight of silent factories and frozen trains became a symbol of how quickly civilization could pause. Machines built to run endlessly were stopped by nature. The workers who once produced the materials of war now queued for rations. Entire cities waited for the sound of engines that did not come. Britain survived the economic paralysis. The trains rolled again. The factories roared back to life. But the winter had exposed a truth the country had never fully acknowledged. Industrial power was not invincible. One season, one freeze, one breakdown of supply lines could silence a nation. When the snow finally began to melt in early March 1947, Britain believed the ordeal was ending. After weeks of motionless trains, darkened homes, silent factories, and hunger, the country waited for the thaw as if it were a promise. But the winter had one more blow to deliver. The warmth that softened the ice did not bring relief. Had unleashed the worst flooding Britain had seen in a century. The danger had been forming silently. Snow lay across the nation in extraordinary depth, to 15 feet in drifts on the high ground, several feet thick across lowland fields. Beneath this blanket, soil was frozen hard. When temperatures rose, the meltwater had nowhere to go. Rivers overflowed. Drainage channels backed up. Every thawed patch of ground released water faster than the land could absorb. The first signs appeared along the Thames and the Great Ouse. Ice on the rivers fractured into heavy slabs that moved downstream, colliding with bridges and piling against piers. Water surged over riverbanks and into nearby fields. Farmers who had spent months watching crops freeze now watched their land drown. Across Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and Essex, farmland became lakes, vast, brown expanses where grain and vegetables should have grown. Railways, just returning to life, faced new chaos. Tracks, weakened by frost, now lay under water. Embankments collapsed. In Kent, entire sections of railway disappeared beneath floodwater, leaving signals and telegraph poles standing like isolated islands. Labourers who had spent weeks digging snow from tracks now dug drainage channels and rebuilt. embankments in knee-deep mud, the fenlands of East Anglia suffered some of the worst damage. These low-lying farmlands, reclaimed from marsh centuries earlier, sat barely above sea level. When rivers burst their banks, fields turned to inland seas. Cattle and sheep, already weakened by hunger and cold, were swept away in the sudden rush. Livestock that survived the winter now died in the thaw, thousands of animals lost in a matter of days. Farmers, who had endured months without income, walked across flooded pastures, searching for surviving animals or salvageable equipment. The flooding deepened the food crisis. Britain's hope for agricultural recovery depended on spring planting. Now, hundreds of thousands of acres were underwater. Potatoes stored in barns were soaked and ruined. Farm buildings collapsed under a combination of rot and floodwater. Government agricultural officers surveyed the damage and warned that planting would be delayed for months, if not cancelled entirely in some regions. Floodwaters reached towns and villages with sudden force. Small rivers swelled into torrents. Streets filled with icy brown water, rising above doorsteps and bursting through ground floor windows. Families evacuated on foot or by boat. Local councils opened schools and community halls as emergency shelters. Wartime memories returned, families sleeping in public buildings, neighbors sharing blankets and food. But this crisis offered no patriotic meaning, only exhaustion in parts of Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and the Midlands. Entire communities were cut off. Roads vanished beneath water. Relief workers used military vehicles and amphibious craft to reach stranded residents. Supplies were dropped by lorry where roads remained passable, and by boat where they did not. The sight was surreal. Milk cans, bread, and coal delivered by rowboat in English market towns. The British Army and Royal Engineers were mobilized. Soldiers built makeshift levees of sandbags, wood, and earth. In some places, they worked day and night, reinforcing crumbling riverbanks as floodwaters rose steadily behind them. Newspapers published photographs of men in uniform waist-deep in freezing water, hauling sacks into place. Without these efforts, flooding would have been even worse. Urban areas were not spared. London escaped the worst of the national flooding, but rivers feeding the Thames submerged roads, factories, and farmland throughout the home counties. Meanwhile, Wales faced swollen rivers surging through valleys already scarred by mining and war damage. In the north, the River Ira flooded Leeds. In the Midlands, the Trent broke through embankments and swept across miles of farmland. Flooding also damaged infrastructure that had barely survived the freeze. Water poured into electrical substations and railway signal boxes. Bridges weakened by frost heave now faced pressure from flood-borne debris driftwood, pieces of buildings, entire tree trunks. Engineers feared structural failure and closed dozens of crossings. Until inspections could be completed, the flood also unleashed hidden dangers. Sewage works overflowed, contaminating water supplies. Wells and pumps failed. Health officers issued warnings of typhoid and dysentery. Fire brigades, which had struggled to access frozen water weeks earlier, now found themselves pumping out streets, basements, and factories. For agriculture, the thaw was a catastrophe. The Ministry of Agriculture estimated that hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland were submerged. Wheat, barley, potatoes, and vegetables meant for spring planting could not be sown. The nation that had hoped to feed itself after years of rationing now faced further shortages. Food imports would have to increase, drawing even more on scarce foreign currency reserves. The human cost, though smaller than in wartime, was painfully real. Dozens lost their lives in floodwaters, drowned while crossing roads, trapped in vehicles, or swept from riverbanks. Livestock deaths were counted in the tens of thousands. The emotional toll on rural families was devastating. For many, the winter had destroyed not only their present but their future. Government ministers had no quick solution. Coal was still scarce, industry was still fragile, and now the countryside lay under water. Newspapers attempted to reassure the public, calling the thaw a symbol of survival. But headlines told another story. Farmland drowned, crops lost, planting delayed, food shortage likely to worsen. Relief efforts expanded. Local councils coordinated boat rescues. Volunteers filled sandbags. Community kitchens fed displaced families. Charity organizations distributed bedding, clothing, and emergency rations. The same spirit of local resilience that had carried Britain through the Blitz returned, but this time it was driven by necessity, not patriotic defiance. The psychological blow was immense. The nation had endured the freeze with the hope that spring would end its suffering. Instead, spring delivered disaster. The idea that nature had defeated Britain twice in cold and then in flood shook public confidence further. The winter's damage was not measured only in broken infrastructure or flooded land. It reshaped government thinking. Britain had assumed that modern industry and technology had tamed nature. The winter proved otherwise. After 1947, engineers strengthened river embankments, improved drainage systems, and expanded flood defenses. The government invested in better forecasting and emergency planning. Lessons were learned at high cost. By summer, the floodwaters receded. Fields dried. Crops were planted late. Trains moved again. Britain carried on, as it always did. But the scars of 1947 remained economic scars, agricultural scars, and memories of a spring that felt like betrayal. The winter that froze Britain had ended not with relief, but with ruin. The thaw announced not victory, but another chapter of hardship. And yet, the country endured. It rebuilt, replanted, and restored. But the winter of 1947 stood as a reminder that even a modern nation could be humbled in days first by ice, then by water. Political pressure had shadowed the crisis from the beginning, but by February and March of 1947, it erupted into open confrontation. What began as a winter weather emergency had turned into a national scandal. Millions of citizens were freezing, factories were silent, food was scarce, and the River Thames itself had frozen. Now, the public asked a question that echoed from London streets to Parliament. How could a nation victorious in war, a world empire, run out of heat and food in peacetime? At the center of the storm stood a few key figures in government hand. One name appeared more than any other: Emmanuel, Minister of Fuel and Power. He had been appointed by Prime Minister Clement Attlee to manage Britain's energy system in the fragile post-war economy. During the war, Shinwell was praised for his command of labor and supply chains. But by 1947, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Newspapers filled their front pages with criticism. Millions without heat. Food stocks run low. Miners work. Government fails. Editorials questioned whether Shinwell had ignored warnings about low coal reserves. The Ministry of Fuel and Power had insisted throughout autumn 1946 that stocks were sufficient for winter. But as storms worsened and supply collapsed, those assurances looked dangerously naive. By mid-February, calls for Shinwell's resignation were printed daily in major papers. Parliament felt the pressure. When the House of Commons reconvened, opposition MPs demanded explanations. Conservative members accused the Labour government of mismanagement and failing to stockpile coal. They claimed that Britain had been so focused on exporting coal to earn foreign currency that it sacrificed domestic stability. Some newspapers repeated accusations that the government had sold coal abroad while Britain's froze. Shinwell defended himself. He argued that the situation was caused by extreme weather, frozen mines, and railway breakdown, not administrative failure. He reminded Parliament that coal workers had strained every muscle to keep mines open. It was not production that failed. He insisted it was transportation. But his explanations were drowned out by public anger. Crowds gathered outside. Government buildings in London carrying signs, "Fuel before politics." And we did not survive the Blitz to freeze in peace. Shinwell received threatening letters. Newspapers published cartoons depicting him sitting comfortably near a blazing fire while ordinary citizens shivered. In darkness, the government understood the scale of the political disaster. Cabinet ministers held emergency meetings at Downing Street, debating whether to deploy troops to help move coal or clear railway lines. The crisis was no longer just about whether it was about credibility. Britain's international standing depended on proving it could manage its own recovery. Prime Minister Attlee addressed the country in February, urging calm and promising relief. In his speeches, he blamed the crisis on a combination of record-breaking snowstorms, frozen infrastructure, and wartime damage still unrepaired. But the public did not find comfort in technical explanations. Many believed something deeper had gone wrong, a lack of preparation, planning, and leadership. The national mood darkened further when the BBC, under energy restrictions, reduced broadcast hours. When the public's main source of information went silent, suspicion grew. People felt cut off, uninformed, and abandoned. Some joked bitterly that during the war, even Hitler couldn't silence the BBC. But now their own government had done it. Parliamentary debate grew heated. Opposition MPs called the crisis a national humiliation. They demanded to know why Britain had not kept greater coal reserves. Why were trains carrying fuel stranded across the country? Why had food imports not been secured earlier? Government ministers responded with numbers, charts, and weather records. But the explanations felt inadequate. Outside Parliament, other voices amplified the unrest. Trade unions criticized the government for shifting blame onto workers. Miners had been accused in some newspapers of laziness or poor output, despite the fact that many mines had continued operating under brutal, freezing conditions. Union leaders defended miners fiercely, arguing that the real failure lay in government planning, not labor. Industrial leaders warned that Britain's export economy was collapsing. Factories could not meet international obligations. Contracts were cancelled. Foreign buyers lost confidence in British reliability. For a country deeply in debt after the war and dependent on global trade, this was a dangerous development. Farmers complained that government regulations prevented them from selling produce directly to hungry towns. Even when food was available locally, rationing laws blocked its free movement. Some farmers publicly challenged the government to loosen controls until the crisis passed. The press fanned the fire. Newspapers that had supported Labour during the war now turned sharply critical. Phrases like government paralysis and Shinwell's fiasco appeared in bold headlines. Journalists pointed out that while Britain froze, other European countries, also devastated by war, appeared to maintain better supplies. Comparisons with France, Sweden, and the Netherlands intensified embarrassment. The government attempted damage control. Coal supplies were redirected to hospitals, bakeries, and transport hubs. The army was deployed in some areas to clear tracks and deliver goods. Power station managers were ordered to use emergency fuel reserves. But every step was reactive, not preventative. The public saw a government struggling, not leading. In late February, Attlee announced new emergency powers under the Electricity Restriction Order, shutting down all non-essential industrial electricity use and further limiting domestic supply. The move was meant to save what coal remained, but it became one of the most widely resented policies of the winter. Factories closed overnight. Workers lost wages. Newspapers printed photographs of darkened city streets. For a nation promised prosperity after victory, it felt like betrayal. In the midst of parliamentary uproar, one question dominated: could the crisis have been prevented? Experts argued that better stockpiling in autumn 1946 could have saved the country. Some said that the export of coal should have been reduced earlier. Others believed the nationalization of coal mines in January 1947, only weeks before the freeze, created confusion in management during a critical moment. The handover of authority from private companies to the National Coal Board had been rushed too fast for winter. Conditions that demanded efficiency and coordination. Government ministers argued that no amount of planning could have prepared for such a winter. Temperatures were the lowest in a century. Snowfall was relentless. Railways were buried. Mines froze solid. In their view, the crisis was caused by nature, not negligence. But politics rarely depends on facts alone. It depends on public confidence. The confidence was eroding. In early March, when the thaw began and floods followed, Parliament exploded with a new wave of criticism. Now the government faced not only fuel shortages and power cuts, but drowned farmland, damaged infrastructure, and looming food deficits. Conservative MPs accused Labour of turning a natural disaster into a national emergency through incompetence. Liberal members likened the crisis to wartime mismanagement without the enemy. During one of the most heated Commons debates of the crisis, Shinwell defended himself fiercely. "I will not resign." His voice echoed across the chamber, but the statement calmed no one. The opposition demanded his removal. Labour backbenchers worried privately that keeping him in office would damage the party. Some historians believe that if Attlee had dismissed Shinwell earlier, political tensions might have eased. Public sentiment reached a breaking point when crowds gathered outside the Ministry of Fuel and Power, chanting for Shinwell's resignation. One London newspaper reported that letters to editors ran overwhelmingly against the government. The British public wanted accountability, yet Attlee held firm. He refused to remove Shinwell, arguing that changing leadership mid-crisis would worsen instability. The Prime Minister insisted on a united front. Behind the scenes, cabinet discussions were tense. Ministers feared that admitting failure would embolden critics and undermine recovery efforts by late March. As coal moved, power returned, and food distribution improved. The political temperature cooled slightly. Factories reopened. Rail traffic resumed. The worst of the crisis had passed, but the damage to the government's reputation was lasting, though the Labour Party remained in power until 1951. The winter of 1947 became a scar on its recorder, symbol of vulnerability and mismanagement that critics would invoke for years. Shinwell never fully recovered politically. His name became shorthand for government failure in public memory. The winter uncovered deeper truths. A victorious empire could not rely solely on wartime glory. Britain's economy was shattered, its infrastructure aging, its supply chains brittle. The crisis forced the nation to confront the reality that victory in war did not guarantee stability in peace. In the end, the political storm revealed something else as well. Britain's future depended not on the past, but on the ability to adapt. The government, shaken by the backlash, pushed forward with infrastructure reforms, energy planning, and agricultural rebuilding. Some of these efforts helped shape modern Britain. But in 1947, as the thaw gave way to floods, and Parliament traded accusations across the aisle, one truth was impossible to ignore: the winter had won, and the nation demanded to know why. History tends to remember governments, ministers, and policies. But during the winter of 1947, when systems failed and institutions staggered, ordinary people became the line between survival and collapse. Across Britain, far from Parliament and headlines, thousands of workers and volunteers kept the country alive quietly, without glory, often without thanks. Their acts of endurance and generosity, scattered in diaries, newspapers, and local records, reveal another side of the crisis. It was not only a season of hardship, it was also a season of quiet heroism. Coal miners were among the first to be pushed to their limits. They worked in frozen pits where machinery jammed and ice formed on the walls. Ventilation shafts clogged with frost. Pumps meant to drain water seized in the cold. Some mines had to be defrosted by hand before production could continue. Yet miners kept going, descending into tunnels day after day, knowing the country depended on their work. They did it while their own families shivered in houses without heat. In mining towns across Yorkshire, Wales, and the Midlands, men walked to work through snowdrifts that reached their chests. Many returned home to dark kitchens where rationed food barely warmed on cold stoves. Despite exhaustion and anger at government failures, production never stopped entirely. Their effort meant hospitals could survive, bakeries could operate, and power stations could resume when rails reopened. Railway workers faced their own ordeal above ground. Across Britain, crews lived outdoors for days at a time, clearing tracks with shovels, picks, and handsaws. They dug locomotives out of frozen siding yards, chipping ice from wheels and couplings. Engineers slept in abandoned carriages or signal huts when storms made travel impossible. Some rail workers collapsed from fatigue. Others suffered frostbite after hours in sub-zero wind. Still, they stayed. Every cleared mile of track represented a lifeline: coal to hospitals, food to cities, fuel for boilers. Without their persistence, the paralysis might have lasted far longer. Doctors and nurses became symbols of endurance. Hospitals had no heat, limited light, and inadequate supplies. Yet staff continued rounds, carried hot bricks from bed to bed, and stayed on shift when transport failed. Nurses wrote later that they worked wrapped in scarves and coats, blowing into their hands to keep fingers warm enough to treat patients. Some lived at the hospital for weeks to avoid walking home in the dark through icy streets. Contemporary reports describe nurses fainting from hunger after long shifts. But they did not leave. In maternity wards, they doubled blankets over newborns and stood watch through the night to prevent cold shock. In elderly care wards, they spoon-fed patients whose hands shook too badly to hold utensils. Every life saved during those months was the result of medical staff who refused to abandon their duties. Grocers and food merchants also played a quiet role. Many shops opened even when shelves were nearly empty, simply so people had a place to go, a chance to get bread, coal, or a bottle of milk if any arrived. Some shopkeepers extended credit to families with no income during factory layoffs, knowing repayment might never come. Others delivered food through snow to customers too weak or elderly to travel. Local papers printed stories of bakers starting ovens with scrap wood when coal ran out, just to produce a few dozen loaves for their neighborhoods. Milkmen completed rounds on foot when trucks failed, carrying bottles door to door through ice-covered streets. Their work kept households, especially those with children, from going hungry in villages and small towns. Volunteers organized on their own. Women's groups cooked communal meals in church kitchens using whatever ingredients rationing allowed. In Nottinghamshire, local women prepared hot soup and bread for stranded train passengers. In Kent, scouts and civil defence volunteers shuttled elderly residents to warming centres. Some villages used tractors to haul supplies to isolated farms. In Wales, miners and farmers together dug out snowbound roads using shovels and horses after machinery froze. Charitable organizations mobilized quickly. The Women's Voluntary Service, the same group that had fed bombing victims during the Blitz, opened emergency canteens and distributed blankets and clothing. The Salvation Army delivered food parcels to families in unheated flats. Clergy across denominations opened church halls as shelters, offering warmth, hot drinks, and companionship for anyone who arrived at their doors. These efforts, while small compared to national need, provided dignity and relief to thousands. One group often overlooked was the lorry drivers. They attempted deliveries when railways failed, navigating ice-glazed roads in heavy vehicles with limited braking power. Many slept in their trucks beside frozen engines, waiting for roads to reopen. Drivers carrying coal relayed between villages, transferring sacks from stalled vehicles to those still able to move. Some drove with chains on their tires, others with nothing but courage and hope that brakes would hold on steep inclines. Without them, isolated communities would have had no supply at all in cities. Firefighters and utility workers bore an invisible burden. They repaired burst water mains in freezing rain. They climbed electrical pylons coated in ice to restore power lines. They pumped floodwater from factories and homes after the thaw. Fire brigades hauled hoses and ladders through snow when engines could not travel. In London, firefighters pumped water for hospitals when pipes froze, working night shifts under blackout conditions caused by power cuts. Ordinary citizens also stepped forward. Families invited neighbors into their flats to share whatever heat they had. Strangers offered rides to doctors, nurses, and essential workers walking miles to their posts. Children helped shovel snow from doorways or carried messages when telephones failed. Even ration books were quietly shared. A loaf of bread here, a tin of soup there, passed from household to household with no record of repayment. These acts rarely appeared in newspapers, but letters, diaries, and local reports preserve them. They reflect a truth often overshadowed by government failures and political anger. While the country strained at the national level, communities held together at the ground level. The psychological impact of this collective endurance mattered. People who lived through the winter later recalled that the hardship was nearly unbearable, yet the solidarity was unforgettable. For many, the memory of neighbors helping neighbors softened the bitterness of the crisis. Britain did not collapse because of fuel reserves, rail lines, or government policy. It survived because people refused to abandon one another. The work was unpaid, unnoticed, and rarely heroic in appearance, but without it, the winter would have claimed far more lives. Historians often talk about the winter of 1947 as a failure of planning, infrastructure, and government. All of that is true, but history is also shaped from the bottom up. Miners swinging pickaxes in frozen shafts, railway crews digging through drifts, nurses bending over frost-covered beds, grocers keeping doors open, volunteers carrying supplies on foot. These acts, scattered across the country, allowed Britain to endure in the end. When the thaw came and life slowly resumed, monuments were not built to these people. Their names did not enter political debates, but they carried a nation across a season when survival was not guaranteed. The winter had exposed the fragility of modern Britain, yet it also revealed its resilience, not through speeches or strategies, but through quiet courage in the cold. When the sun finally returned, it did not feel like triumph. It came gradually, first as softer winds, then as days when snow turned to slush and icicles dripped from rooftops. After nearly 2 months of cold, the first mild afternoons should have brought joy. Instead, Britain stepped cautiously into spring, exhausted, changed, and uncertain of what came next. By early April 1947, temperatures rose above freezing across most of the country. Snowbanks that had towered over roads and railway lines shrank to dirty piles of ice. Children who had spent winter wrapped in coats indoors finally played outside, stamping through puddles where drifts had stood. But the relief was uneasy. The thaw exposed wreckage hidden beneath the snow. Back gardens where ruined fences collapsed, sheds splintered by frost, roofs sagging from the weight of ice, driveways cracked, window frames swelled and split. Water pipes that had burst during the freeze now leaked across hall floors and down staircases. Workers stepping into abandoned factories found machinery rusted, warped, or frozen beyond repair. Farms were flooded or coated in mud, their spring planting delayed by weeks. Families emerged from their homes like survivors of a long siege. Many had lived on rationing and borrowed food, carrying debts to neighbors or local shops. Savings, if they had existed at all after the war, were gone. People had sold furniture, heirlooms, even clothing for coal or bread. Now they faced not celebration, but rebuilding. Rail workers continued clearing debris from tracks as melted. Snow revealed warped rails and collapsed embankments. Engineers repaired signaling systems damaged by ice. Crews pumped water from tunnels, stations, and freight yards. Trains slowly returned to normal routes, though delays continued for weeks. Their movement brought a psychological shift, the sound of engines, the smell of coal smoke, the first signs of economic life stirring again. Factories restarted as power supplies improved. Electric motors turned over, belts moved, furnaces fired. But restart did not mean recovery. The lost weeks of production had cost companies contracts, wages, and materials. Industrial towns feared layoffs, and some fears proved true. A few small businesses never reopened. Frozen stock, damaged equipment, and unpaid bills forced closures. Rural Britain faced the longest recovery. Fields looked like wetlands. In Kent and Lincolnshire, standing water stretched for miles. Farmers who had waited all winter for planting season now stared at ruined soil. Weeks passed before tractors could enter fields without sinking. Agricultural reports estimated that hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland would miss the planting season entirely. With rationing still in force and imports already stretched thin, the food crisis deepened rather than eased. Livestock losses took a heavy toll. Dead cattle and sheep, buried in snow for weeks, reappeared during the thaw. Farmers hauled carcasses by hand from flooded pastures. Feed was scarce. Surviving animals were thin and weakened by the cold. Government relief programs offered compensation, but payments were slow and limited. For farming families still recovering from wartime labor shortages and machinery damage, the losses were devastating. In towns and cities, the emotional recovery was just beginning. After weeks of darkness and cold, people tried to resume normal routines. Street markets reopened, though supplies remained thin. Schoolchildren returned to classrooms warmed by repaired boilers. Churches held Thanksgiving services. Pubs filled again not with celebration, but with talk of hardship, loss, and survival. Letters and diary entries from the time describe an unusual feeling, relief mixed with trauma. There was no single day when the crisis ended. It faded slowly, unevenly. One district gained power while another lost it. One railway reopened while another closed for repairs. One town received food deliveries while another waited. Hope returned step by step, never all at once. Government ministers traveled across the country, surveying damage. Newspapers published photographs of flooded farms, collapsed barns, and railway workers rebuilding track. Public anger remained, but exhaustion overshadowed it. Many citizens had no energy left for politics. They only wanted normal life to return. Community organizations continued relief efforts well into spring. Women's voluntary service groups delivered clothing and bedding to families whose homes were too damaged to heat. Local councils distributed emergency grants for repair work. Churches collected donations. In some villages, neighbors rebuilt barns and fences together, sharing tools and labor because professional builders were scarce. Britain's economy became a patchwork of recovery and setback. Steelworks fired again, producing materials for reconstruction. Shipyards resumed production for commercial fleets. Textile mills restarted looms, but damaged equipment and lost orders slowed progress. The government pushed for increased industrial output to make up for lost time, and workers responded. Though many remained physically weakened by months of cold and rationed food in London. The return of spring highlighted contrasts. Parks turned green. The Thames thawed. Birds returned. But bombed buildings, still unrepaired from the war, stood beside waterlogged ruins from the flood. Housing shortages that had plagued the capital since 1945 worsened as storm damage forced evacuations. Thousands of families lived in temporary shelters, boarding houses, or with relatives, for children. The winter became a memory of extremes. Teachers reported weight loss, stunted growth, and lingering health complications from cold exposure and hunger. Hospitals treated cases of frostbite and respiratory illness well into April. Yet children also adapted quickly. Within weeks of the thaw, London playgrounds filled again. Ice that had once covered the Thames turned into water, and small boats returned. Psychologically, the winter left a mark deeper than any ledger could show. The generation that had endured the Blitz had believed that nothing could shake the nation again. But the winter proved that hardship did not require bombs or enemies. Nature could be just as destructive, and because the crisis happened in peacetime, many found it harder to accept. There was no shared enemy to blame, no speeches of victory, no medals for survival. When farmers looked over ruined fields, when miners walked home from shifts to cold houses, when grocers restocked empty shelves, they did not feel victorious. They felt worn, but despite exhaustion, Britain did what it always did: moved forward. The government launched rebuilding programs for damaged agriculture, transport, and housing. Engineers inspected riverbanks and drainage systems, planning improvements to prevent future floods. Coal stocks were refilled, rail networks repaired, power stations upgraded. Lessons were written into policy and, in time, into history, and, as the spring weeks passed, flowers grew where snow had crushed the earth. Birds sang in gardens where pipes had burst. Markets filled slowly with fruit and vegetables. A country that had been locked in ice began to breathe again. Yet even decades later, those who lived through it remembered. They remembered the silent trains, the thin meals, the frost on bedroom walls. They remembered neighbors sharing food, nurses carrying hot bricks, miners working by candlelight, children fainting in cold classrooms, and they remembered the feeling on the first day. The sun warmed their faces, not joy alone, but something heavier. The understanding of how close the country had come to breaking spring finally came. Britain survived, but it never forgot the winter that tried to stop it. When the crisis ended, Britain did not return to the country it had been before the snow. The winter of 1947 had not only frozen rivers, shut factories, and emptied cupboards. It had exposed weaknesses that had remained hidden beneath the pride of wartime victory. In the months and years that followed, the nation rebuilt. But the rebuilding was not only physical. It was political, economic, and social. The winter had forced Britain to confront the reality that modern life was more fragile than almost anyone had believed. In the short term, the government rushed to stabilize the basic foundations of national life. Coal stockpiles were replenished and protected. Fuel depots were expanded. Rail lines damaged by snow and floods were rebuilt and reinforced. Electrical generation, once taken for granted, now became a national priority. Engineers accelerated repairs to power stations still damaged from wartime neglect. The electricity restriction order was withdrawn, and factories restarted production. But the memory of darkness lingered. The most sweeping change, however, came in social policy. The winter had revealed how close ordinary families were to disaster. Many had survived only because of neighbors, volunteers, and medical staff pushing themselves to exhaustion. For Britain's leaders, this became an argument for a stronger welfare system, one that protected citizens from crisis without depending on charity. Just 1 year later, in July 1948, the National Health Service began operation. The timing was not accidental. Plans for the NHS had existed before the freeze, but the winter gave them new urgency. Parliament debated the long-term vulnerability of Britain's hospitals, many of which had nearly collapsed when heat failed and supplies ran low. The idea that healthcare should depend on a person's income or the strength of a local charity now seemed dangerous. The winter had shown what happened when hospitals lacked resources. Patients froze in their beds. Doctors cancelled surgeries. Equipment failed. When the NHS opened, it promised something Britain had never seen before: medical treatment for every citizen, free at the point of use. Historians agree that the winter of 1947 helped the public accept this transformation. The hardships made it clear that health could not be left to chance. The crisis also accelerated modernization of utilities. Coal had been the lifeblood of Britain. In 1947, when coal supply broke, everything else broke with it. The government began exploring alternative energy sources, investing in oil-fired power stations and experimenting with early nuclear research. Electrification projects expanded, connecting rural areas that had long depended on coal fires for heat and light. The Ministry of Transport pushed for modernization of the rail network, including new diesel locomotives, less vulnerable to freezing temperatures. The winter had also exposed the fragility of Britain's agriculture. Flooded farmland and lost livestock deepened food shortages and forced the country to rely heavily on expensive imports. In response, agricultural policy shifted. The government expanded mechanization grants, drainage improvements, and fertilizer subsidies. The goal was clear: prevent hunger from ever becoming a national threat again. Even commerce changed. The rationing system, already strained from the war, was extended instead of abolished. Bread remained rationed until 1948. Meat, butter, tea, and eggs remained on coupons into the early 1950s. The winter had shown that rationing was unpopular, but necessary. Without it, poorer families might have starved. The government introduced stricter monitoring of black market activity and improved distribution logistics. It was not glamorous policy, but it stabilized the food supply. Economically, the damage took years to repair. Factories lost months of production. Export contracts were cancelled. Britain's financial reserves, already drained by war debt, suffered further losses. The crisis contributed to the government's decision to seek emergency support from the United States and to participate in the Marshall Plan. The winter did not cause Britain's post-war austerity, but it deepened it. Reconstruction became slower, wages stagnated, and rationing lingered far longer than anyone expected. Politically, the winter left scars. The Labour government, elected in 1945 with a massive majority, saw public confidence weaken. Although the government survived until 1951, the memory of the winter became a weapon for opponents who argued that Labour had mismanaged the nation. Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power, never shed the stigma of the crisis. His name became shorthand for failure, and his political influence faded. Yet the legacy was not only negative. In some ways, the winter strengthened the idea of collective responsibility, a belief that Britain should face crisis not as individuals, but as a society. The government expanded civil defence, planning to include peacetime disasters. Councils developed emergency fuel reserves. Weather forecasting and hydrological monitoring advanced. Engineers improved river embankments, drainage systems, and flood defences that remain part of Britain's infrastructure today. Communities changed as well. The winter reinforced bonds built during the war. People remembered neighbours who shared heat, volunteers who hauled coal, nurses who worked through the cold, and railway crews who dug tracks by hand. Modern British culture still carries echoes of that solidarity, the idea that hardship is endured together. The psychological legacy was quieter, but real. The generation who lived through the winter learned that victory in war did not guarantee comfort in peace. A modern city could freeze as easily as a medieval one. Progress was not permanent. It required maintenance, planning, and humility. Even decades later, elderly Britons recalled the winter not as an inconvenience, but as a trauma: the frost on bedroom walls, the silence of factories, the long queues for food in classrooms and textbooks. The winter of 1947 became a case study in how weather could paralyze an industrial nation. Historians compared it to the worst winters of previous centuries, noting that the impact was amplified by Britain's dependence on coal. Engineers and planners studied the crisis to design systems that could not be undone by weather alone. It remains a reference point for British emergency planning, energy security, and infrastructure design. Yet the true legacy lies not only in policy or planning or economics. It lies in the memory of endurance. The winter stripped Britain down to its essentials: food, warmth, fuel, survival. What remained was a society forced to look at itself honestly. It saw weakness, yes, but also strength. Miners in frozen pits, rail workers digging out trains, doctors performing surgery in unheated rooms, families sharing rationed bread, volunteers carrying blankets through snow. Britain changed in ways no one could see at the time. When spring came, the country rebuilt not just machines and fields, but systems and beliefs. Slowly, the improvements took hold. Hospitals united under the NHS, power grids modernized, farmlands restored, and rail lines reinforced. In the years that followed, Britain grew more prepared, more organized, and more aware of its own vulnerabilities. The winter of 1947 is often called the worst in modern British history, but it was also a turning point. It forced a nation to build a safer, fairer, more resilient future. Its legacy does not lie in the cold itself, but in the changes that followed, changes that shaped the country. For generations, the winter tried to bring Britain to its knees. Instead, it pushed Britain forward. In the decades that followed, the winter of 1947 slipped quietly out of headlines and textbooks. Britain rebuilt, rationing ended, and new generations grew up never knowing a world where frost gathered on bedroom walls. But for those who lived through it, the memories remained vivid, charred more sharply than years of war, more haunting than any bomb or siren across Britain. Oral histories, recorded interviews, diaries, and memoirs capture what statistics cannot. The human experience of a winter that tested a nation. Many survivors described the same moment when cold became something more than weather. One woman from Derbyshire, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled opening her eyes one morning to find her blankets coated with frost. "I thought I'd left the window open," she said. But it wasn't the window. It was just the air, so cold the walls were white. She had survived the Blitz as a child, but she said the winter of 1947 was harder, because this time the cold was everywhere, and it never stopped. A railway worker from Yorkshire remembered spending days digging trains out of snowdrifts, sleeping in a frozen carriage because roads were impassable. In an oral history recorded for a local museum, he described chipping ice from locomotive wheels with his bare hands once his gloves had frozen stiff. What stayed with him was the silence, the absence of engines, whistles, movement. It was like the world had stopped. Not a war pause, not a blackout, just nothing. Farmers left some of the most painful testimonies. The National Farmers Union kept written reports of lost livestock, ruined crops, and fields drowned in the thaw. One farmer from Lincolnshire wrote that watching water rise across his land was like watching a lifetime disappear. His family had kept cattle on the same ground for generations. That year, he buried more animals than he saved. Many farmers never recovered financially. Some left agriculture altogether, unable to rebuild equipment and herds already weakened by wartime shortages. For children, the memory was different, but no less lasting. Many survivors remembered wearing coats, scarves, and gloves in schoolrooms. Teachers read lessons with breath visible in the air. A woman from Kent, interviewed in her 70s, recalled fainting in class from hunger. Milk deliveries had stopped for weeks, and food rations barely stretched to feed families. "I'd never been so hungry, not even in the war," she said. Everyone talks about bombing raids, but children remember empty stomachs. In some schools, teachers used braziers to warm infants. One headmaster, writing in a school log preserved today, noted that children were sent home early because classrooms were as cold as outdoors. Yet classes continued as long as possible, because closing schools meant children returning to unheated homes. Hospital staff wrote of scenes that haunted them decades later. In interviews with the Royal College of Nursing, retired nurses recalled placing bricks heated in kitchen ovens at the feet of patients. One nurse from London, who later became a matron, said she felt more helpless in that winter than during any air raid. During the Blitz, hospitals had at least been supplied. In 1947, she said, "We were fighting the cold with nothing at all." Doctors, too, recorded their experiences. In the British Medical Journal, physicians described operating in near darkness, cancelling surgeries because sterilization machines could not heat. Some wrote of elderly patients who died not from illness, but from exposure in their own hospital beds. Their testimonies became part of the historical record, not as dramatic flourishes, but as clinical reports: heart failure brought on by hypothermia, infections worsened by malnutrition, children collapsing from exhaustion. Families wrote letters to relatives abroad, many preserved in archives and family collections. The themes were similar: cold, hunger, helplessness. One mother in Manchester wrote to a sister in Canada describing her children sleeping in coats beside a lit candle for warmth. The candle was not for light. It was placed on a small tin to heat the air around it. "We feel ashamed," she wrote, "that after winning the war, we cannot keep our children warm." There were also memories of kindness. Survivors often recalled neighbors sharing spare blankets, coal, or bread. Diaries describe strangers helping each other carry water when pipes froze, or pushing handcarts through snow when deliveries failed. A woman from South Wales remembered a miner knocking on her door with a bucket of coal, taken from his own household supply. "He said he'd seen smoke from our chimney stop," she recalled. "He wouldn't take money. He just said, 'It's too cold for children.'" For many, the hardest memories came after the thaw. Floods tore through villages already weakened by the cold. Oral histories from East Anglia describe barns collapsing and animals drowning. A farmer in Cambridgeshire remembered standing in water up to his knees, opening gates to let cattle escape rising floodwaters. "We had spent weeks trying to keep them alive through the cold," he said. "Then the water came, and we could do nothing." Factories remembered the winter as well. Engineers wrote in post-war trade journals about restarting machines clogged with rust or still frozen solid. Workers recalled returning to silent workshops, their machines wrapped in ice. One machinist from Birmingham told an interviewer in the 1990s, "We opened the doors and it was like stepping into a graveyard. The machines looked dead." Among the elderly who survived, the winter carried emotional weight long after physical wounds healed. Some said they feared cold weather for the rest of their lives. Others never trusted government promises again. A veteran of the Royal Navy, who had fought at sea and endured German submarines, told a BBC interviewer decades later, "The winter was worse. In war, you expect danger. In peace, you expect life to get better." Many survivors, expressed a lasting sense of disbelief that the crisis could happen in modern Britain. They had won a world war, invented radar, broken enemy codes, and built some of the world's most advanced machines. Yet a season of snow had shown that modern life could collapse in days. Historians studying oral testimonies note a recurring theme. People felt the winter stripped away illusions. The war had united the country against a common enemy. The winter offered no such clarity. There was no enemy to fight, no victory to celebrate. Only waiting day after day, week after week, for warmth and food that did not come. And yet, survivors also remembered laughter. Even in the coldest days, children played in the snow. Teenagers slid across frozen streets. In some cities, people built snowmen in bombed-out courtyards, decorating them with coal dust and ration tins. Memories of hardship mixed with moments of absurdity. One Londoner remembered a policeman guiding traffic on skates. Another recalled children skating on a frozen canal until officers chased them away for fear of thin ice. When spring arrived, the first signs of recovery felt overwhelming. Green shoots in gardens, thawed soil, the sound of water running where ice had stood for weeks. Survivors described opening windows to let in warm air for the first time in months, but they also remembered the smell of damp wood, mold, and flooded earth. Rebuilding was slow, exhausting work. What they lost was not only food, fuel, or livestock. Some lost family members. National statistics recorded thousands of excess deaths, mostly elderly, sick, or malnourished people who could not survive cold exposure. Many families buried loved ones in frozen cemeteries, snow still covering the ground. Some funerals were delayed because roads were impassable. Others were held with only a handful of attendees, the rest unable to travel. What survivors learned was equally lasting. They learned how quickly normal life could disappear, how fragile modern systems were, how a nation built on coal could be paralyzed when coal stopped moving. And perhaps, most of all, they learned the value of community, not as a sentiment, but as a necessity. A miner from South Yorkshire said it simply in an interview. Recorded before his death, "The government didn't save us. We saved each other." By the time the 1950s arrived, Britain was on a different path, rebuilding cities, expanding welfare, electrifying rural areas, strengthening rail and power networks. But the winter shaped older generations quietly, even invisibly. Some hoarded food for decades afterward. Others refused to complain about cold because they had known worse. Many kept extra coal, blankets, or provisions long into retirement. The memory did not fade. Today, archives hold thousands of fragments of the winter, rationed books with missing pages, photographs of drifts swallowing country roads, letters written in pencil because ink had frozen, diaries filled with short entries, "No coal today, children hungry, pipe burst, another night without heat." Each line represents a family enduring another day at the edge. In the end, the survivors did not describe the winter as a heroic story. They described it as a test, one they had not expected and did not choose, but endured. Few told their stories publicly. Many shared them only late in life, when asked by grandchildren or historians. But whenever they spoke of it, the details returned with perfect clarity, not because the winter was dramatic, because it was unforgettable. And when those who survived finally passed their stories into history, the lesson they handed down was not one of despair, but of endurance. They had lived through the coldest winter in modern British memory. They had faced hunger, darkness, flood, and fear, and they had emerged, changed but unbroken.